Good morning and good afternoon again, and welcome to this third of our panels in our ongoing conference on the Fatimids. Today's panel, which I'm chairing, is on the Fatimid Daʿwa, and Daʿwa is a favorite subject of mine. We have 4 speakers. Now, our speakers today are all colleagues and friends. They're all doctors and professors. So I will not repeat these titles, each time I mention their name. The first speaker is Omar Alí-de-Unzaga, who is the head of our Quranic Studies unit. They've done fantastic work in that unit, and they just published the 2nd volume of anthologies of tafsir, which we launched a few years ago. Omar is looking at a very interesting topic. He's looking at al-majāz of the chief Da'i, Al-Muʻayyad fī'l-Dīn al-Shīrāzī, and how he sort of expresses his views against those who claim, that the majāz in the Qur'an. So he's an anti-majāzi. He expresses his anti-majāzi view. I think we'll start with you, Omar, and then I will introduce each speaker in turn. The mic is yours, Omar. Go on.
Thank you. Today is Thursday, the 10th of February of the year 1059. The evening prayers have finished. The Maghrib and the Isha prayers have been combined. It's around 7 o'clock in the evening. It's beginning to get cool in Cairo. It's about 18 degrees or so. We make our way to the palace complex, more specifically to the Western Palace. In the southern part, there is an annex called the Dar al-Ilm. There is exultation in the air. On the one hand, the news have arrived in Cairo that al-Basasiri has conquered Baghdad. The Fatimid flags are flying in the city, in the mosques, and in the great mosque, the khutbah is being recited in the name of al-Mustansir Billah, the Fatimid Imam Caliph. On the other hand, there is also exultation in the air, especially among the Da'is, because the 29-year-old Imam Caliph al-Mustansir Billah has just appointed, about 3 weeks ago, a new chief Da'i, Hibatullah ibn Musa of Shiraz. The doors open and we find la crème de la crème of Fatimid officials and the uppermost Da'is. We sit down, silence is made in the room, and the chief Da'i enters. A man about to turn 60 is introduced with the title Safi Amir al-Mu'minin wa Waliyuhu, the chosen of the commander of the believers and his friend. That's quite a title. But people know him as the recipient of divine support in religion, Al-Muʻayyad fī'l-Dīn al-Shīrāzī. The Da'is are happy because finally a true Da'i has been appointed as their chief. The last Da'i we had was appointed by the vizier himself, the powerful Al-Yazuri, in the person of his own son. And let me remind you that Al-Yazuri is said to have been a Sunni from Palestine. Al-Yazuri has been executed about 3 weeks ago. So for the first time for the first time in a long time, we have a master of ta'wil delivering the speech. Al-Muʻayyad has had a long career. He has been writing his life in what will be called the Sīrā, which is crowned by his successful diplomatic mission, especially in Syria, and especially in convincing Basasiri on coming over to the Fatimid side and eventually conquering Baghdad. Al-Muʻayyad fī'l-Dīn is just waiting for the details on the conquest of Baghdad, which we know from history that he will include as the final pages of his Sīrā. If Al-Mu'izz, the previous Imam and Fatimid Caliph, if he could make an order for cherries to be delivered from Baalbek in Syria in one day via pigeon post, then surely the news that arrive from Baghdad to Cairo would take about a day and a half or 2 days. So there's an air of triumphant elation in the air. I mentioned Al-Mu'ayyad's diplomatic mission. Now he has begun a new mission. And we know that he will stay as the chief of this mission for the next 20 years or so until he dies. The Da'i begins reading. In fact, he has written his speech, his majlis. We know from history that he will, in the next 20 years, write about 800 of them. And after about 100 years after his death, the third Musta'li Tayyib Da'i, Hatim ibn Ibrahim al-Hamidi, rearranged the majalis thematically, but he also denuded them from the introductory and closing formulas, which are typical of these kind of speeches. Hatim ibn Ibrahim also grouped the majalis thematically in a book called Jami' al-Haqa'iq, the Compendium of Truths. This was published in 2 volumes by Hossam Khaddour in 2012, although we also have another epitome, Talkhis, also attributed to Hatim, of the first 100 majalis, which was published by Abdul Qadir Abdul Nāṣir in 1975. Now, when one encounters versions of books that have been abridged, like the Jami' al-Haqa'iq with regards to the 800 majalis, there is a natural curiosity in a scholar to find why an abridgment was necessary. Perhaps for reasons of size, or perhaps more importantly, we need to look at what was left from the original. Because the abridgment leaves out the initial blessings and the final exhortations, then I went to the original majalis to see what was left out of this epitome. I began to read from Majlis 1, 2, 3, and when I reached Majlis number 3, I realized that we encountered something really unusual: the denial of majāz in the Quran. Why is this unusual? Why is this unexpected? My own bias was because I knew that the most famous author who has denied majāz in the Quran was Ibn Taymiyyah, of course, a later figure. In his Kitab al-Iman, he says there is no majāz in the Quran. Even words like hand, face, eyes, and the like with reference to God are haqiqah and not majāz. They are true and not figuration or figurative expression. Now, the translation of majāz, of course, is part of the complexity, but here was I looking at the epitome, looking at the original. Okay, the initial blessings have been removed from the epitome, but they are there in the in the original, and what do we find in the blessings? Now, let me take you back to the Dar al-Ilm, and we will hear what Al-Muʻayyad has to say. Al-Muʻayyad begins his majlis number 3 with the praise of God, as is customary, and at this point he says that God's words are not stained by the blemish or by the stain of figuration. To find this negation of majāz in a book which is supposed to be the pinnacle of Ismaili ta'wil works, called for some further investigation. Was it possible that Al-Muʻayyad, the chief Ismaili Da'i, was saying that the Quran is unblemished of majāz? Were the Ismailis not supposed to interpret the Quran metaphorically and allegorically? Why then would he call majāz a disgraceful blemish? As it turned out, my research led me to reconsider some of the givens that are taken for granted by some of the scholarship, such as, for example, that ta'wil is a method, which is not, or that ta'wil is something which is translated as spiritual hermeneutics. Now, we need to really be calling into question these assumptions and the repetition of these terms. Next, Al-Muʻayyad continues with the blessing of the Prophet and his family. His carefully and clinically selected semantics and terminology is saturated with allusions that require familiarity with the intricacies of Quranic interpretation across the various schools. This indicates, again, that the audience were expected to follow these references. So, in other words, the listeners were not simply rank and file, but well-trained scholars, possibly intermediate and advanced members of the Fatimid institutional Daʿwa or convocation, called. After the Prophet, the blessings fall on Ali, described as the son of Abu Talib, the flank of God, Jambullah. Here is a perfect example of the allusions that require background knowledge. How to understand the appellation, the flank of God, or the side of God. Al-Muʻayyad adds a comment. For the one who regrets is the one who abandons the flank of God. Al-Hasir man farrata fi jambihi. Now, this is a Quranic allusion, okay, to Quran 39:59. Ya hasrata ala ma farratu fi jambillah. How I regret to have abandoned the side of God. Two elements are key to understand this allusion. Firstly, the Shi'i Imams call themselves the side of God or the flank of God. For example, in the tafsir of Ali ibn Ibrahim al-Qummi, Jafar al-Sadiq said, we, nahnu, are the flank of God. Nahnu jambillah, jambullah. And this is found in a number of Shi'i sources. There's a famous speech attributed to Hazrat Ali, I am the eye of God, the flank of God, I am the hand of God, I am the gate of God. So these are allusions. People will be familiar with them in the audience. But more importantly, this tells us that the majalis has to be read as an intratextual, with an intratextual lens. Because allusions that are made in one part of the work or the book will be clarified by parts elsewhere. The second element, which I think is subtly alluded, is the tendency in Quranic commentaries, and more especially among the Mu'tazilis, to interpret the anthropomorphic expressions about God as metaphors for something else. For example, Al-Sharif al-Radi, the Mu'tazili-influenced Baghdadi Shi'i, who belongs to the generation before Al-Mu'ayyad, provides a set of possibilities to interpret, all of which interpret Jambullah, the side of God or the flank of God in order to avoid a physical reading. For example, that it means command, the command of God, or the path of God, or the obedience to God, etc., etc. Next, Al-Muʻayyad continues in a very dramatic way. When the leader of the revealed law of Islam, Ra'is Shari'at al-Islam, becomes led by others, a great confusion ensues among people's tongues, tabalbalat al-alsina. And the theologians' speculative discourse multiplies. Kathura min al-mutakallimin al-kalam. Now, this could be read as an allusion to the decadence of the Abbasid rule that al-Basasiri has just contributed to topple, to the ascendancy of the Buyids in the past decades and centuries. Especially, it could be a reference to an allusion to the golden age of Mu'tazili Kalam, as we can see in the support of Sahib al-Abbad, the promoter of rational theology, as Professor Madelung and Schmidtke have referred to him, which shows that Mu'tazili theology and their ta'wil to interpret anthropomorphic terms of the Quran in a metaphorical way was the prevalent theology in Baghdad at the time. And this seems to be in the background of what Al-Mu'ayyad is trying to attack. I have no time to go into how the Mu'tazili, the polemics between the Mu'tazilis and the Ismailis was a large component of the background that must have been at the back of the mind of Al-Mu'ayyad. Next, Al-Mu'ayyad states that language is only of two kinds, either true or false. And he gives an example, which is a verse from the Quran, Quran 6, verse 122. Is he who was dead and we gave him life and appointed for him a light to walk among the people as one whose likeness is in the shadows and comes not forth for them? So the idea here is whether someone who is dead is to be read is a figure of speech, or is it the real meaning? Is it haqiqa or is it majaz? Again, I have no time in this paper to go into the very complex history and evolution of the terms haqiqa and majaz. They were not always paired as a dichotomy. Wolfhard Heinrich has masterfully discussed this in his seminal articles. But let us just say that this is the key of the question. If the Quran says someone who is dead and God gave him life, how is this to be read? Al-Mu'ayyad says that because majaz is seen at the time of Al-Mu'ayyad as the opposite of haqiqa, then majaz is understood by Al-Mu'ayyad as non-reality. Now, the complexity is that in most literary approaches by a number of authors, Abu Ubaida, Al-Jurjani, and Baqillani, and many others, both mutakallimun and mufassirun and others, a paradox came to happen, which is that haqiqa came to refer to the literal meaning of the text, while majaz was used to refer to the not only metaphorical but the true meaning of the verse. So, for example, someone who is dead and we gave him life, is interpreted in most texts as meaning that someone was ignorant or someone did not have faith, and God gave them life, meaning he gave them knowledge or gave them faith. And so death and life are seen as haqiqa because they are literally true, but they are understood in a majazi way. Let me remind you that majaz also means transposition or translation into something else, much as the Greek metaphor, which means to transpose something to another place. This is the predominant view, especially among mutakallimun and especially also among the Mu'tazila. Al-Mu'ayyad fī-Dīn has a problem with this because he says, if majaz is the opposite of haqiqa, and he understands haqiqa as truth, not as literal meaning, then Al-Mu'ayyad says there is no place in the Quran for majaz. I have to wrap up. It's a very, as you can see, it's a very complex argument because there's a lot of allusions and a lot of history of these very charged terms. But in conclusion, I can say that Al-Mu'ayyad understands majaz as referring not to something metaphorical, but to something which is not real, meaning something which is transient. In fact, he applies the term majaz to the life of this world, to the material life of this world, which he calls something which has a duration and that comes to an end, as opposed to the real life. So Al-Mu'ayyad refuses to contemplate the dichotomy haqiqa majaz, which he sees as faulty and fallacious. The reason is because the term haqiqa, which means truth, came to be associated with literal meaning, and majaz came to designate real meaning. So Al-Mu'ayyad has a problem with this. This puts Al-Mu'ayyad in an impossible position. He cannot accept that the word truth is haqiqa, is attached to something which is the literal meaning that he considers as the non-truth. Therefore, that's number one. And number two, and finally, I conclude, he could not tolerate that majaz, which was supposed to be conveying the true meaning according to the mutakallimun, was in the hand of people who applied their own ra'i, their own independent thinking, and not depending on the authoritative teaching of the imam of the time, which is, of course, the work that Al-Mu'ayyad, the idea that Al-Mu'ayyad defends. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. You kept within your time. It's well done. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Daniel Beben. He will speak about Nāṣir-i Khusraw, a key figure in Ismaili history and Daʿwa. He was, as we know, a multifaceted figure about whom we also have some legends, including a pseudo-biography. And we will hear, I think, about how he operated in that remote region while he was in regular contact with the headquarters of the Daʿwa in Cairo. And that's how the Daʿwa reached the remotest part of the Iranian world, in which the Nāṣir-i Khusraw was active as Da'i. Over to you, Daniel.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Daftary, for that kind introduction. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this. I'd like to begin by dedicating this presentation to the memory of a great Pamiri scholar of Ismailism, Khalil Baghdadi Khudayev, who passed away just recently. and whose scholarship was notable for exploring some of the interpretive possibilities for Ismaili thought in the social realm. His work has partly inspired some of what I am presenting here today. In scholarship on the Fatimid era, there is, of course, a natural tendency in scholarship to privilege the perspective of the Fatimid state itself and to take the political center as our main point of orientation. But during the Fatimid period, Ismailism became a very widely spread phenomena, including in some of the most marginal areas of the Islamic world at the time, such as the Badakhshan region, which will be the focus of my talk here today. And despite the overwhelming attention that is paid to the Fatimid Empire in scholarship, when we look at the broader scope of Ismaili history, at where Ismaili communities have survived and persevered the longest, it is not within the territory of the Fatimid state, but rather in the most marginalized and peripheral regions like Badakhshan, where it has maintained the longest presence. My paper here today is part of an effort to understand the role and the contribution of the Ismaili Daʿwa to the broader process of Islamization, especially within Central Asia. Islamization has generally been considered as part of a process that accompanies in one form or another the expansion of Islamic political authority. But I would like to consider here also how forms of resistance to the caliphate or resistance to other sources of Muslim political authority could also be productive for the process of Islamization. I'd like to draw attention here to the work of the anthropologist Anna Singh, who has proposed a concept of friction as a model for understanding the process of globalization, in which globalization is understood not merely as a sort of clash between a global and local culture, but rather something that is produced and enacted at the local level through friction. I'd like to suggest that this can also serve as a productive model for understanding the process of Islamization as well. I'd like to introduce here the concept of frictional Islamization, which I define as varieties of Islamization that emerge through a process of resistance to and dialogue with hegemonic forms of Islamic political authority, and which seek to maintain or expand autonomy through alternative expressions of Islam. We can see this dynamic at work through a number of examples. The broader region of Upper Tukharistan in Central Asia, of which Badakhshan was a part, demonstrated a great deal of resistance to the Arab conquest. Among other things, the Badakhshan region for a time served as a center for the Murji revolt led by the anti-Umayyad rebel Harith ibn Saraj. And it's actually in connection with his revolt that we can see some of the earliest evidence in the sources for Islamization within the Badakhshan region. So Badakhshan was one of a number of regions within the Iranian world, along with other places such as Dailam, that had a strong history of resistance to the Arab conquest. And I would argue that's probably not a coincidence that these same regions later became strongholds of Ismailism and other forms of Shiism. So in this paper, I want to explore further the question of whether there may indeed be some basis for establishing a connection between the Ismaili Dawa and expressions of political autonomy, and to better understand the issue of the possible motivations for political elites who express an interest in Ismailism. Now, to be clear, I think it would be a grave mistake to reduce Ismailism to any sort of political doctrine or ideology. At the same time, it's also clear that throughout history, and especially in the Fatimid era, there were significant political implications associated with the espousal of Ismailism outside of the Fatimid state. In recent years, we have seen some renewed attention paid in scholarship to the activities of Fatimid Da'is in Iran and Central Asia. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Fatimid Da'is were particularly active within the Boyid and Samanid territories in Iran and Central Asia. And we do find a number of cases in which various political elites and even some rulers in these territories express interest in Ismailism and provide patronage to Fatimid Da'is. One of the classic examples being a relationship between Mu'ayyad al-Din Shīrāzī and the Boyid Amir Abu Khalija. In almost every case, however, the interest expressed by political elites towards Ismailism tended to be rather short-lived and almost always met with significant resistance from and opposition from other elites. As a result, we find hardly any cases in which this relationship between a ruler and the Da'i leads to a sustained pattern of engagement and support for an Ismaili community. the Ismaili state in Multan and Sindh being a notable exception. But one important example that has not received sufficient attention, I think, is the case of Nāṣir Khusraw's patron in Badakhshan. If we look a little more closely at this example, I can believe it can help us to better understand some of the underlying issues regarding the political dynamics of the Daḥwa. And I want to look here particularly at a recently discovered document from Badakhshan that I believe provides some critical insight into this topic. So let's turn now to look more closely at the example of Nāṣir Khusraw. Nāṣir Khusraw dedicated his last dated work, the Jama Hikmatain, to a local ruler that he describes as the Emir of Badakhshan, and whose name he gives as Abu Ma'ali Ali ibn al-Asad al-Harith. Now, it's clear from Nāṣir's dedication that this individual is obviously a supporter of the Ismaili movement, at least for a period of time. He elsewhere refers to him in his work as a Mawla, the Imam of the time. We also know that Nāṣir spent the final years of his life in a place called Yumgan, which is today a district within the Badakhshan province of Afghanistan. And he frequently refers to Yumgan in his poetry. And of course, Nāṣir's shrine is located there as well. Now, most previous scholarship that has discussed Nāṣir Khusraw's career has assumed that this figure of Abu Ma'ali Ali, to whom he dedicated his Jama Hikmatain, was in fact his primary patron, and that he was also the ruler of Yumgan. What I want to argue here is, in fact, there's some substantial evidence to suggest that this was not the case, and that Yumgan was actually under the rule of a separate emir, and that this individual, and not the ruler of Yumgan, was actually the primary patron of Nāṣir Khusraw. The emir of Badakhshan, to whom Nāṣir dedicated his Jama Hikmatain, may have been more politically powerful, but his interest in Ismailism appears to have been more limited and temporary. Aside from Nāṣir Khusraw's work, this figure is not mentioned anywhere. There is some numismatic evidence that might indicate that his ancestors had served as governors of Badakhshan in the Samanid era, but we do not find any evidence referring to any sort of dynasty extending from him in later sources. His lineage simply disappears after Nāṣir's mention of him. However, as I mentioned earlier, there's some evidence to suggest that the region of Yumgan, where Nāṣir spent the final years of his life, may in fact have been politically autonomous from Badakhshan and have had a separate ruler at that time. There's a tendency sometimes to talk about Badakhshan in a rather homogeneous way as a single geographical or cultural region. But it's important that we look at the issue of internal peripheries and power dynamics within this region in order to get a better understanding of how the Ismaili Daḥwa may have unfolded and operated there. Now, Yumgan is a relatively obscure place, and we find very little information about it in other sources. But we do find a number of references which clearly refer to Yumgan as being politically autonomous from Badakhshan. The earliest reference to Yumgan comes from the 7th century travel account of a Chinese Buddhist monk who clearly refers to Yumgan, again, as autonomous from Badakhshan. We also find a reference in the work of Ibn Khordadbeh from the late 9th century that refers to Yumgan as its own independent province. And we find references to this effect in Nāṣir Khusraw's poetry as well. Badakhshan is mentioned only 5 times in his divan, 3 of which are in the context of the literary aphorism Lali Badakhshan. And it's never referred to in a context that would imply that Nāṣir actually lives there. By contrast, Yumgan is mentioned more than 50 times in the standard edition of his poetry, and consistently referred to as the place where he actually lives. In fact, we have one verse, as I give here, where Badakhshan and Yumgan are mentioned together, clearly as separate places. Also, if we look at the biographical accounts of Nāṣir that appear after his death, until the 15th century, they consistently mention Yumgan and not Badakhshan as the place where he lived. In some cases, explicitly identify Yumgan as separate from Badakhshan. It's not until the 15th century, after the Timurid conquest of Badakhshan, that we see a shift in the sources in which Yumgan becomes referenced as part of Badakhshan. And Badakhshan subsequently becomes, in the narratives, the place of Nāṣir Khusraw's exile. So Yumgan effectively becomes sort of swallowed up by Badakhshan over time. It's difficult to say when exactly this happened. It was clearly sometime after Nāṣir Khusraw's death, and probably not until sometime after the Mongol conquest. Excuse me. So it seems quite clear that Yumgan was not actually a part of Badakhshan in Nāṣir Khusraw's time. But what about this question of Nāṣir's relationship with the ruler of Yumgan? In this matter, we face a significant problem. Nāṣir himself, while he does refer frequently to Yumgan in his poetry, does not anywhere mention the name of its ruler. Moreover, it's not until 400 years after his death in the 15th century that we start to find some of the earliest sources produced in Badakhshan that provide accounts of Nāṣir and his career in the region. But we do have later sources, especially from the 16th century onwards, a substantial body of legendary and hagiographical accounts of Nāṣir Khusraw. I don't have time to discuss this literature in detail here. For the most part, it has received rather little attention on scholarship. But there is one element from this body of literature that does commonly appear in many of these accounts. And this is a story about Nāṣir's arrival in Badakhshan, which says that initially the Emir of Badakhshan is welcoming towards him and offers him a position in his government. But then a rumor arrives that Nāṣir is an Ismaili heretic and he's kicked out of Badakhshan and flees from there to Yumgan, where he's given protection by a local ruler by the name of Jahan Shah. And there's a story that this figure of Jahan Shah becomes a disciple of Nāṣir and changes his name to Umar Yumgi. Now, even though there are clearly many legendary elements to these narratives, in this story, this account of Nāṣir, having had a separate and perhaps more committed patron in the Yumgan region, does accord with what little we know of the context from the time. So there's reason to believe that this part of the narrative, at least, may reflect some memory of historical events connected with Nāṣir and his career in the region. I also want to mention here a text that came to light just recently from a private collection in the Rushan region of Tajik Badakhshan. This is a text dated to the early 15th century, 1426 to be exact, which is a genealogical scroll or a nasabnama of Malik Jahan Shah, the ruler of Yumgan that I just mentioned. And this is a very important discovery for a number of reasons. This now constitutes the earliest Ismaili text we have from Badakhshan after the time of Nāṣir Khusraw. And it provides some critical insight into the development of Nāṣir's legacy in the region. The core of the text, as I mentioned, is a genealogy of Malik Jahan Shah, which claims him as having been a Sayyid. But it also contains a narrative account in verse of Nāṣir Khusraw's arrival in Yumgan and of his relationship with Malik Jahan Shah. It describes how Jahan Shah abandoned his kingship and his wealth and became Nāṣir's disciple. Now, there's a great deal more that I could say about this text. I have a publication in process in which I discuss this in greater detail. But briefly, what is significant about this source is the understanding that it articulates regarding the significance of Nāṣir Khusraw's arrival in Yumgan, and that it's not framed in terms of the adoption of a universal doctrine of Ismailism that is expressed through conversion, but rather the establishment of Yumgan as an autonomous sacred space. And here, this points to the key issue when we consider why local rulers might have professed an interest in Ismailism in the first place. As I have mentioned, it is important to look more closely at the internal political geography of a place like Badakhshan. It's not in the political center of Badakhshan itself where Ismailis flourished historically, but rather it was in the more peripheral districts of Badakhshan, places like Yumgan, and later in places like Shugnan, which also has a long history of seeking autonomy from Badakhshan. It's in what we might call these autonomy-seeking spaces that Ismailism finds the most welcome reception among local elites. So I want to conclude here by thinking a bit more about why this might be the case, why these local elites might have an interest in Ismailism in the first place. On the one hand, it is clear that Ismailism offered very little in the way of material benefits. In fact, interest in Ismailism could prove to be a very strong liability. Rulers, historically, who expressed interest in Ismailism often did not stay on the throne for very long, as is perceived as a form of heresy and a threat to political order. I think this explains why somebody like the Emir of Badakhshan appears not to have continued his interest in Ismailism. Badakhshan from the 10th century onwards was under the control of governors who served under the rulers of Khorasan, first under the Samanids and then under the Ghaznavids, the Seljuks, and others. So the Emir of Badakhshan would have been dependent upon his relationship with his political superiors for his position. Now, he certainly may have had a personal interest in Ismailism at one point, but he probably did not want to jeopardize his position by pursuing it too far. But in other places, there might be a different calculation. And once again, this is where we need to consider the political logic of indirect rule in the place of internal peripheries. Empires like the Samanids or the Ghaznavids seem to have preferred tributary rule over Badakhshan rather than direct annexation. And of course, in doing so, would prefer to work with one single client in a region rather than a patchwork of local rulers. But we can see that in the case of Yungan, there is clearly a precedent for autonomy from Badakhshan, and its rulers seem to have maintained an interest in retaining this autonomy. So there is once again a different calculation here, in that the local ruler of a place like Yungan would actually have had rather little to lose by entertaining an interest in Ismailism, since they are not dependent upon their relationship with the governors of Khorasan or with the Caliphate in the first place. Now, obviously, there is very little to be gained in a material sense by embracing Ismailism. It's not as if the Fatimid military was prepared to march troops across Central Asia to assist a local client in Yungan. But I would argue rather that we need to consider this issue within the ideological realm. There's now a significant body of scholarship in the history of religions, looking at events like the Protestant Reformation, for example, which suggests that the intentional pursuit of religious difference can serve as a means of facilitating claims to political autonomy. I think that at a very basic level, this is part of the logic that we see at work here. That new or innovative religious ideas often become attractive to political elites who are seeking to revise the status quo in one way or another. And it's also in this case that I would point to the work of anthropologists working in the fields of ritual studies and cosmology, particularly to the studies of Frederick Barth, who I believe has developed a conceptual model that might help us to better understand this process. What the work of Barth offers is a look at how cosmological visions, and in particular the ritual actions associated with cosmological beliefs, can serve as a means of articulating social and communal distinctions. Most importantly, he points to how cosmologies are not merely a fixed system, but rather something that undergoes a constant process of change and renewal through human creativity in response to changes in social conditions. And this is where I think his work is very useful for reconsidering the role of the Ismaili Dawa outside of the Fatimid state. Much has been written, of course, about the cosmological systems that are articulated in Fatimid Ismaili literature. But I would argue that we need to give more attention to how these systems are received and reworked at the local level. Perhaps we should not think of Ismailism as a singular cosmology or belief system that is adopted through a process of conversion, but rather Ismailism can be seen as a starting point for the articulation and generation of local cosmologies and systems of knowledge. Once again, this is why this 15th century document that I mentioned offers some critical insight into this process, as it demonstrates how, through the figure and itinerary of Nāṣir Khusraw, Yungan becomes conceptualized as a designated sacred space in relation to broader systems of sacred geography, connecting it with Arabia, with Cairo, with Khorasan, and expresses a vision of Yungan, not merely as a politically autonomous space, but as a site of religious significance as well. So I will conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Our next speaker is my colleague, Dr. Maria de Cillis. She has a paper on the Da'i Al-Kirmānī, who was perhaps the most eminent philosopher and theologian of the Fatimid period, and belonged to the so-called Iranian school of philosophical Ismailism, the members of which nevertheless disagreed amongst themselves on a variety of concepts and issues. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Dr. Daftary. Thank you to the organizers of this very, very interesting conference. I'm trying to share my slides here. Can you see them? Yeah?
Yes.
Yes. So what I'll try to do in the next 20 minutes is try to delineate Hamiduddin al-Kirmānī's ideas of nature. And in particular, I will try to do that by highlighting the metaphysical and the esoteric correspondences that were employed by Al-Kirmānī, in particular throughout the Rahtul Aql, but also in his Kitab al-Rihad. And I will be doing it by using some of the cosmographies and the diagrams that are scattered in the Rahtul Aql in particular. And I'll try to emphasize how Al-Kirmānī was trying to really put forward a very Fatimid answer to what were several previous but also contemporaneous Ismaili intellectual conundrums. Now, we know that Hamiduddin al-Kirmānī was able to create successfully a very complex system of thought, and he was able to blend within it inherited Ismaili traditions and, of course, Greek philosophical strands, in particularly drawn from Aristotelianism, but also from Farabian Neoplatonism. And Hamiduddin al-Kirmānī, as Dr. Daftary has mentioned, was one of the most prominent Da'is during the Fatimid time. And he was very much operative during the reign of the Imam Caliph al-Hakim bi Amrillah. And he set for himself, amongst other things, obviously, the task of intervening in doctrinal controversy, which had erupted, as Dr. Daftary has mentioned already, amongst the foremost representatives of the so-called Iranian school of Ismaili philosophical theology. So amongst these scholars, we find Abu Hatim al-Razi, Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Nasafi, and Abu Yaqub al-Sijistani. And in particular, in this, one of his latest works titled the Kitab al-Riyad, Al-Kirmānī tries to harmonize the often contrasting views of these peers, of his Ismaili predecessors. And as Professor Poonawala has indicated, he tries, and to a certain extent, manages to do so from the vantage point of post-Farabian Neoplatonism. So before looking at Al-Kirmānī's own idea of nature, it is important to look back at what he actually inherited, in particular from the Greek thought. Aristotle would have thought and would have indicated and described nature as an inner principle of change and being at rest in his Physics, books 1 to 4. And Aristotle would have contrasted this understanding of nature with active powers or potentialities. But what was important for Aristotle was to ground his discourse within causality. So very much linked to the idea of nature was his understanding of everything that is in existence as being a compound of matter and form. Plotinus, on the other hand, has a different approach to the idea of nature, and he speaks of the sum total of the realm of nature as a host of dynamic principles, what is identified by the term logoi. Nature is also identified by Plotinus as the result of the universal soul contemplation, and is identified also with the thing that allows all other beings to become what they are. That is to say, to fulfill their ultimate end, what a word that is in Greek indicated by the term telos. Now, this point is very much akin to what we will be discussing in Hamiduddin al-Kirmānī's, the understanding of nature as a viable source, as a means for existence to reach or somehow to be spurred towards what Al-Kirmānī identifies as the second existence or second perfection. Nature in Plotinus is also understood as the lowest part of universal soul, because it's actually the process of the universal soul contemplation of the intellect, obviously, and is considered as an immanent spiritual source, an immanent spiritual principles, which allows the reality of the sense world to be truly what it is. Now, for Plotinus was key to stress that nature is much more related to form than to matter. It is a spiritual principle, and because of its spiritual character, it allows the sensory world, the sense of the world of generation and corruption, to be truly real. Now, what we do understand for reality in this sense is akin to what Al-Kirmānī discusses in terms of a perfect actualization of the second perfection, and we will be looking at this in this presentation. So great scholar like Armstrong would have stated that matter in Plotinus philosophy could not be considered responsible for the reality of the sense world. Al-Kindi inherits very much the principles, the Aristotelian principles, and he defines nature as the principle of motion and rest after motion. But even more significantly, nature is identified as الطريق إلى سكون, the way leading to rest, where rest, obviously, yet again, is identified as the realization of full actuality, or differently put, the last fulfillment. Now, these ideas resonate very much in what Al-Kirmānī tries to pinpoint regarding the essence of nature. In particular, in his Rahtul Aql, in the fifth rampant of his Rahtul Aql, in particular in the first three pathways of the rampant, Al-Kirmānī tries to identify what nature is, how it is related to existence, and how it is related to the world. What role does it play? He points out that nature's quiddity is a single thing in essence in the world of body, but is many things in respect to its actions. And very significantly, and in relation to what I've mentioned in terms of Plotinus' understanding of nature, Al-Kirmānī also states that nature has two ends. With the first one, we are talking about nature as a cause, which allows the things that it inheres it to be existent. So what Al-Kirmānī says is existence is nothing else than a presence in this world of something in which nature actually inheres. But on the other hand, nature has also a passive character in the sense that it becomes the subject of its own force. It becomes what is caused, ma'ful, to become upon a second perfection, a second existence, or a second perfection. So what Al-Kirmānī is trying to say, and he actually states it in the third pathway of the fifth rampant, is basically trying to locate nature. What is nature? What does nature include? Nature's place, he says, is positioned between these two ends. So on the one end, we have nature as being an active character, and on the other hand, it has a passive character and becomes the effect or what is caused by its own force. And another important point that Al-Kirmānī puts forward is the understanding of nature as having knowledge, having a kind of knowledge which allows it to be not fully perfect, but to have some kind of perfection about it. This is obviously very different from what Plotinus would have stated. In Plotinus, nature can act, but the contemplation that nature has of the universal soul is a kind of dreamlike contemplation. It cannot be really considered a proper form of intelligizing. In the Rahtul Aql, Al-Kirmānī so defines nature as life in actu, emanating from the world of holiness, which obviously in the cosmic larger sense is the Ruh al-Quds. And nature as such permeates the world of body, but on the other hand, nature is also the mover of everything in which it resides, and the perfection of the existence of the latter through its own perfection. So from another perspective, nature is not only existence per se, does not grant existence per se, but it also becomes the life in potentia, that is to say, the possibility for this existence to reach the second perfection, which in many treatises, Ahmed-Din Al-Kirmānī identifies the second perfection as full intellectualization, so the achievement of a full intellectual status, and in particular, the full understanding of what Tawhid, the principle of Tawhid, really implies. Which obviously for Kirmānī was absolute transcendence of God, so the absolute unity, unicity of God, but also the stripping away of divinity to anything other than God. And this idea was very much pertinent in the time in which Ahmed-Din Al-Kirmānī operates. In particular, we know that he was very much linked to this task of denouncing the Druze's understanding of Al-Hakim as being a personified God. In yet another diagram that we find in the Al-Muʻayyad, which describes the world of unity from the aspect of its composition, Al-Kirmānī obviously positions the first intellect well above the other intellects. We have 10 intellects, very much akin to what was the Farabian emanative schema. And significantly, Al-Kirmānī positions the third intellect, which is defined as prime matter and form, in a direct relationship with nature. Nature is described in this specific instance as the world, the world which, with its planets and stars, and what is in them, which encompasses many things. Now, the third intellect is identified by Al-Kirmānī as an aql al-murtaqi, that is to say, a reason intellect, an intellect that rises back from the 10th position and achieves its third position thanks to the bestowal of the intellectual benefits. So it is through the intellectual benefits poured from all the other intellects that the third intellect achieves its third position. And is also described as a mutaakhir, that is to say, let's say, an intellect that achieves its second perfections afterwards, in comparison to the instantaneous achievement and realization of primary and secondary perfections that belongs to all the other intellects. So somehow the third intellect is associated with the world of nature because they share a form of composition. So they're associated with the idea of tarkib and also with the idea of the Sharia as being the result of composition of laws, obviously bestowed by God upon the Prophet. So from this perspective, nature would be very much, the understanding of Al-Kirmānī's of nature would be very much more similar to the Aristotelian idea. So we find already a combination of Plotinus ideas and Platonic ideas and Aristotelian ideas. Another important point that is very much linked to Al-Kirmānī's understanding of nature is the role that he grants to the astral body of the sun, Shams. He is positioned bang in the middle in his in intellectual pleroma, and the sun is considered to be responsible for life and for the emanation of souls in bodies, which is very much what in other parts of the Raḥtul Al-Kirmānī understands to be the role of nature. And in particular, it becomes the emanative source of individual souls. He has illuminating rays and becomes a vivifying force, which is basically the principle of vivifying all the sublunary bodies as well as the terrestrial ones. If we look at some of the diagrams that are presented in a Raḥtul, not always, there's not always consistency, I have to stress this, but in majority of cases, what Al-Kirmānī tries to do is reconcile the idea of the Farabian emanative schema, where we know that there are 10 intellects. However, in order also to fulfill his own Fatimid agenda, Al-Kirmānī complements the Farabian schema with other elements. So we have a total of 14 principles, including the 10 intellects derived directly from Al-Farabi, but also other elements, in particular the four elements of fire, earth, water, and air. And Desmet has highlighted that one of the ends, one of the purposes for this organization was that to understand that of positioning the sun in a very central position, very eminent position. And if we look in particular at this specific diagram, we can see that the sixth sphere is associated with the planet of the sun. The planet of the sun is associated with the rank of the Sadis, the sixth, and is associated on the other hand, so in the realm of correspondences, that really characterizes Al-Kirmānī's thought, with the action of the zakat. Now, this idea of the zakat could be understood, obviously, could be put in a sort of parallelism with what is the vivifying force of the sun, but also the fact that the sun is associated with the pouring down of intellectual benefits. So in the same way as the intellects bestow benefits upon everything that is being created, in the same way the zakat allows whoever is in a needy condition to ameliorate his own status. However, the stress that Al-Kirmānī puts on the figure of the sadist could be associated with the position and the role that had been played by the Imam al-Hakim, that is considered to be the sixth in line with the Fatimid Imam, in the same way as the bestowal of almsgiving could have been associated with the role that al-Hakim had played in trying to make the education a very important point in the Fatimid Daʿwa. However, if we go through the Rahtul Aql, we continue in our search through Al-Kirmānī's diagrams, we can see that the sixth position that is still associated with the planet Sun is also linked to a very specific figure within the Hudud-id-Din, who is the Da'i al-Balagh. Now, this Da'i al-Balagh in the Fatimid time seem to have been a kind of intermediate position operating between the headquarters of Fatimid Cairo and on the one end and the headquarters of Adar Jazeera. But even more significantly, what I found quite striking is this association of this particular Da'i with Rutba al-Ihtijaj wa Ta'rif al-Ma'ad. So the initiation into this concept of Ma'ad. Why would Hamid ad-Din al-Kirmānī associate the sun and the Da'i al-Balagh with this idea of Ma'ad? What is this understanding of Ma'ad, usually translated with the notion of the return? Now we know that in Ismailism, the great significance is associated with the number 7, not specifically the number 6. However, Hamid ad-Din al-Kirmānī also emphasizes that in the realm of correspondences, the 6th sphere is associated with the 7th intellect, because the universal soul is dissociated from any celestial sphere. So we would have a correspondence of the 7th intellect with the 6th celestial sphere. And the number 7 obviously plays such an important role within the esoteric correspondences in Ismailism, in particular when it's associated with the idea of the Qa'im, the ultimate resurrector. And even before the advent of the Qa'im, it was acknowledged within the early Airo history of Ismailism that pretty much every seventh Imam in each cycle, in each era, would have been identified as an Imam Qa'im of the cycle. That is to say, an Imam that would have brought about a minor Qiyamah, bringing forward the new esoteric teachings. And at the time of Fatimid times, these Imam Qaims would have been identified specifically within the era of the Prophet with figures such as Muhammad ibn Ismail, Al-Mu'iz, and also particularly Al-Hakim bi Amrillah. Now, this idea of the return is probably also a direct criticism. It's also linked to a form of criticism that Hamid ad-Din al-Kirmānī puts forward in his Kitab al-Riyad, referring to what should have been included in the Nusra written by Abu Yaqub al-Sijistani. Obviously, we don't have the Nusra anymore with us. It's not no longer extant work, but many extracts can be extrapolated from the Kitab al-Riyad by Kirmānī, and to a certain extent also the Kitab al-Islah penned by Abu Hatim al-Razi. And differently from what al-Kirmānī would have stated, the sun, so the planet sun and the vivifying force of the sun, is associated by Abu Yaqub al-Sijistani with the antecedent, that is to say the intellect. And in the realm of correspondences that are identified also in the works of Abu Yaqub al-Sijistani, the sun is identifiable with Muhammad ibn Ismail, who was believed to be the Imam Qa'im, coming, of course, in Saturn, who would have physically returned as the final resurrector. This was an understanding that Abu Yaqub al-Sijistanis would have displayed early in his career, so rather than in his later writings, where it would have been more akin to Fatimid ideas. And one of the consequences of this understanding was also the identification of the soul, of the universal soul, as the follower, often associated with the moon rather than the sun. And this idea of the universal soul as being the follower of the intellect was very controversial for Al-Kirmānī. Al-Kirmānī tries to harmonize his views with that of Sijistanis by simply saying that the follower, the universal soul, could be considered as a follower because it is defective in action and not in essence with respect to the intellect. The idea of the soul as being defective, however, had very serious theoretical consequences in Abu Yaqub al-Sijistanis, because it would have implied the necessity for the soul to be incarnated in all the individualized souls, and this would have had consequences from Amir ad-Din al-Kirmānī. It would have implied ideas of metempsychosis and so on. And al-Kirmānī is extremely critical of metempsychosis, and yet, in a very kind of holistic tendency, he absolves his peers. He's basically saying that in the Kitab al-Riyad, although Sijistanis is very borderline with this idea of metempsychosis, he actually declines it in the 44 Iqlid of his Kitab al-Maqalid, sorry, al-Maqalid wal-Malakutiyya. So the idea of the Qayyim was very much also present in Abu Hatim al-Razi's understanding of creation. But in the end, what I really wanted to stress is that the capacity of Hamid ad-Din al-Kirmānī to really harmonize a series of ideas coming from Plotinus, Aristotle, Farabi, and obviously trying to harmonize also the views. Yes.
We have to wrap it up now.
Yes, yes. And tries, so he's displaying a very kind of holistic and, if we want, cosmopolitan attitude. Thank you. Done.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria. Our final speaker on the panel is Dr. Alí-de Qurboniev. He has already done extensive work on new ways of textual readings and analysis. And I suppose we'll give some of that in this paper. Aslisho, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daftary. Could you please stop sharing, Dr. Cillis?
Yes, if I knew how to
thank
do
you
it.
very much. I'm
Yes,
going to, okay, thank you. Okay, I shared my screen and I hope you can see my slideshows. Can you? Okay. All right, thank you very much, Dr. Daftary, for the introduction, and thank you for the organizers for including me in the conference. I also like to thank my fellow panelists for giving me 3 excellent examples of Fatimid scholars, cosmopolitans, to whom I will be referring in my paper. In my presentation, I present my efforts to explore cosmopolitanism through the textual corpus produced by the Fatimid Da'is, the elite of the Fatimid Daʿwa in the broader context of Islamic written tradition. I will explore these concepts at the beginning, Fatimid cosmopolitanism, and then link it to textual communities. And then I will go into the textual corpus that we have at hand, the open ATI corpus, and explain a little bit the corpus approach. And then I show a few examples of the digital analysis that I call DNA analysis at the Kitab project with whom I am affiliated now. So cosmopolitanism typically denotes the ability to transcend cultural boundaries. Empires and imperial agents are thus known to benefit from it in order to consolidate their power. This desire on the part of the Fatimids and the agents of the state and the Daʿwa are thus explicit in their doctrines, state policies, art, and so on. As we can see from the evolution of Fatimid doctrines in the Egyptian phase, the Daʿwa did not erase, but rather embrace the difference with the Eastern Da'is. This is but one example of how they drew strength from cosmopolitanism. often others were also pointed out yesterday by Dr. Daftary and by other presenters. Also, the Fatimid Empire, like other empires of antiquity, was less interested in creating a homogeneous religious culture across its territory, as it was interested in subordinating them to the caliphate. This is a well-known mode of integration in universalist empires. So when we talk about Fatimid Cosmopolitanism, we are usually talking about two things. One is the social diversity of Fatimid Empire and its elite. And the second is a particular Fatimid view about human societies and communities, either in their doctrinal works or a view that comes from the historical narratives. And we find these ideas, of course, in the works of the Daʿwa, such as in the works of Nāṣir-i Khusraw or Al-Kirmānī. And their thought includes ideas about peaceful coexistence of communities, or the one truth, the universal law, a single goal for humanity, and so on, which are all affiliated, associated with the idea of cosmopolitanism. Also, as we look at the da'is, the provenance of these three da'is that we talked about in this panel, they all come from different regions of the eastern region of the Islamic world, but also I will be talking about Al-Qadi and Nu'man, who comes from the western end of the Islamic world. So they all represent the Fatimid elite who thought of themselves as cosmopolitans. So the social aspect of Fatimid Cosmopolitanism thus can be seen as theoretical universalism in practice. However, Fatimid's engagement with subordinate groups within their empires, such as what we can observe in their encounter with the Malikis and with the Sunnis and Ibadis, for example, through the practice of court disputation, was to reinforce the subordination of these groups by recognizing them as such. I also engage with yesterday's presentation by Dr. Shīrāzī Hajiani, and how he problematized the idea of cosmopolitanism. It is in the modern, it's often, obviously and often associated with, as it has positive connotation, but it also had negative connotations, such as in the Soviet Union, cosmopolitanism was seen as used as an abusive term against, mostly against Jewish intellectuals. But there's also the Soviet example shows us how the Soviet Empire, or Soviet elite, the Russians, for instance, in this case, they recognize the national entities or ethnic groups, but also elevated the position of Russian cosmopolitan or Soviet citizen above the others. So I will not stay here too long for this discussion, but then what's this analytical value of the term cosmopolitanism for understanding of Fatimid da'is and the text that they produce? As scholars of cosmopolitanism have shown, the imperial elite often conceived of themselves as cosmopolitan, and therefore it must not be surprising that they attempt to transcend these boundaries. And in studying this textual corpus, I also draw on the work of Etienne Wenger, the educational theorist who generally talks about community of practice, but the textual communities can also be seen as a community of practice, which are defined by their mutual engagement, joint enterprise, and shared repertoire, rather than their ideologies and social networks and other forms of belonging and identity. So I have the wider scholarly community, let's say in the Fatimid period, in mind, who are all Muslims, and they have different ideologies and identities. Some of them are Ismaili, some of them are Muslims or Sunnis, and some of them are even non-Muslims, but all of them engage with the textual corpus. And in the case of the Muslims, they all have recourse to certain texts, such as the body of history, historical texts, but also the Qur'an, the Sunnah, the Hadith, and so on. So this allows us to define them as one body, one community, one textual community. And by engaging with these communities, the Fatimid da'is kind of inserting themselves into these communities, textual communities, and try to influence it, of course, and reinterpret this. So whatever the body of text is in question is, whether it's the Quran or Hadith or doctrinal texts, they're also, by definition, communities of practice. And this conceptualization, namely shifting the focus from ideational and relational understanding of communities and their formation to the shared practices of knowledge transmission, and will allow us to appreciate these influences, inter-madhab influences, which are often unimagined. So Now, moving on to textual communities. I believe computational text analysis, which is my main thing here today, these approaches and linked open data pools will allow us to move in this direction. You can see the European Union's linked open data project on the right-hand side, and then which links thousands of databases to each other. And then on the left-hand side, my modest attempt to visualize the Arabic textual tradition for the first 5 centuries. I've kept it abstract deliberately to not get, to not just get distracted by the details, but this basically it is a stylometric network derived from stylometry of the all Arabic text that we have in our corpus, in the Open ATI corpus, and shows, with this, I attempted to show the position of Fatimid text within the larger universe of texts. And one of my presentations, if someone is interested, you can look it online. But there I, for instance, discovered where the Ikhwan al-Safa and other Ismaili philosophical texts are situated within this textual universe and their proximity to other disciplines, for instance, the tafsir or to kalam and to Greek philosophy, for instance. So this is just an example of how when we look at the text, we also should imagine that these people are also, they're not working in vacuum, but they're connected, they're engaging with other texts, they're reading each other's text. And we may sometimes not even, when we look doctrinal texts, we may not even think about the larger context, but this allows us to get closer to that. So most of my presentation for this conference paper has been preparing and exploring the textual corpus, which has been challenging, especially because there are not enough machine-readable digital text for the Fatimid Daʿwa. But luckily, what we have now, most of these come from the Fatimid period, and most of them come from the Fatimid period. Sorry, 1 second. I'm just moving on to the text, to the visual interface to show the, sorry, okay, to show what I am doing with these texts. So what we have here is a selection of Fatimid texts which we have in the Open ATI corpus. When I joined the Kitab project, which is curating the biggest Arabic language text, which we call Open Islamic Text Initiative, we had only, in the beginning, we had only 3 Fatimid texts, and they were the Qadi al-Nu'man's Daʿwa al-Islam, and then Sharh al-Akhbar by Al-Qadi al-Nu'man, another text, I think, by al-Naysaburi, Ifbat al-Imama. So by now we have about like dozens of texts from the Fatimid period that we have included in the Open ATI corpus, and here we can see them, majority of them come from the Maghreb, thanks to Al-Qadi al-Nu'man. Many of them come from Yemen, later Fatimid Daʿwa, and then later Tayyibid Da'is mostly contribute to this part. And then we have also Fars, represented by Mu'ayyad al-Shīrāzī, Iraq, and so on. And in terms of volume, is also the 4th century has the largest number of texts in it. So you can see it's more than 2 million words or tokens divided by authors. In the lower panel, you can see this visualization of the 4th century, 5th century, and then 9th, 7th, 10th. This corpus is, of course, not representative of the entire Fatimid texts. We still, preparing OCR, we're still adding more text to the corpus. But this is the case with the entire Islamic tradition. We don't have text for, or enough text, or all of the text that we have in the manuscript form or digital print form. It's very incomplete. We don't have enough text for any tradition, but we are building it, and hopefully this will allow us to have different insight or more insight, or ask different questions from the corpus. So what I'm going to show you in the next remaining probably 10 minutes or more from what I have left is to show you this interface, so Power BI application that I created to analyze these texts. So this one, which I call the Daʿwa al-Islam app, or the DNA of the Daʿwa al-Islam, is an app to understand or explore the text reuse or the alignment that the Kitab project produces to find alignment between the Daʿwa al-Islam and the entire Arabic corpus that we have. So in other words, if Da'iya al-Islamist cites other hadith tradition from the early period, then we must be able to find alignments, textual alignments or citation between Da'iya al-Islam and other books in the corpus. I also here, so we can, in this interface, we can look at the text reuse or citation of Da'iya al-Islam through divided by different regions of the Islamic world, from Al-Andalus to Central Asia to Sijistan. And then you can also select one of these periods, Abbasid period or early Islamic period, and see whether Al-Qadi an-Numan cites someone from the early period. Or if you look the later period, then you can also see whether, you can check whether Al-Qadi an-Numan is cited by later scholars. You can also, of course, these above definitions are more loose and more difficult, but you can also look at the first centuries or second by century. So you can look, for instance, to the first century and see whether Al-Qadi an-Numan is citing from someone from the first or second or third century. Of course, there are not many texts cited from this, or texts exist from this period, but if you look at the 4th century, you will see more citations or parallel texts between the Da'im and others. So you can see that Qadi al-Numan is also cites himself in the Da'im al-Islam. He quotes himself. So we find a lot of this in Da'im al-Islam. We find other texts as well. This one is Khulaini, who latest Shia scholar, who is not citing from Al-Qadi al-Numan, but because they're using the same sources, we find parallel texts. And when we click on them, we can look at these texts in the below panel and read them side by side. We can also see who is the top reuser of Al-Qadi al-Numan, and not by the 4th century, but by the entire period. If you look at here, you can see that Al-Qadi al-Numan, Tabarsi is Imami scholar of the 19th, 20th century, is copying him entirely, followed by Majlisi, and then Al-Qadi al-Numan himself, and so on, Khulaini later. So this was just a basic overview of this application. Here on this panel, you can see the entire book spread over a 2-dimensional space, of which we divide into milestones. One milestone is equal to almost 300 words, but you can think of it as one printed page. So we have about 700 pages on the x-axis, and then on the y you have the number of words in each citation. So if the alignment is 200 words, you see it here. So that means there's a big chunk of word parallel between Al-Khulaini here and Al-Qadi al-Numan. I hope when I click here, you can also see on your screens. Depends on the speed of the internet. So I know it can be complicated because I've been working with this for some time, but also difficult to explain, especially if you're not exposed to this sort of looking at the text. We are all used to more like reading the book from cover to cover, but we're not. This is a new way of reading the text. This page that we're looking now at is the Hamiduddin al-Kirmānī's Rahat al-Aql, which we just talked about, Maria's presentation. So again, with Rahat al-Aql as well, you can choose each of the region through this application. Khorasan, for instance, and see if he's using someone from Khorasan, you get 2 people. Few citation with Naysaburi. If you look Sijistan, you can obviously expect him to cite Abu Yaqub al-Sijistani. So you have a lot of parallel with Abu Yaqub al-Sijistani in different parts in the beginning of the work, and then also at the end of this work. Next application that I want to show, next book to analyze is the Asas al-Ta'wil. So I have chosen 3 different texts. One is the legal text, the Da'im al-Islam, and the second text was Rahat al-Aql, philosophical text, and this one is Asas al-Ta'wil, a work of completely different genre, Ta'wil genre. And the parallels and the citations are very different. Obviously, there's a lot of shared Quranic citation in the text, and you can see the congregation, a lot of citation. These are cited, these verses here probably are cited by many scholars in the corpus. And you can again check by regions, select one region and see who else is engaging with the same verses or maybe quoting from Al-Qadi and Oman. We don't know, I haven't studied it, but you can also select just this one portion of the text here and then look it up close what's going on in there. Also, you can choose just a range of dates on all of these instances. You can just check or select one range and see who else is using the text in this period. Let's say before Al-Qadi and Oman's death, who is 975. So you can check that these are all texts so that have parallel alignments who lived before Al-Qadi and Oman, and a lot of these are Quranic citations. So we can see the green ones here are the Quranic citations, and they are parallel with other scholars as well. The top reusers of Al-Qadi and Oman, the top book that has parallel citations with the Asas al-Ta'wil is Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, the work of the Tafsir. And then the second one is the Quran. The second most cited work in the Asas al-Ta'wil is the Quran, which is not surprising. But the third one is Abu Mansur Maturidi, probably also because of the parallel Quranic citation, which is maybe for some sort of analysis, it may not be useful, but still for someone who wants to explore the different interpretation of the certain or Quranic verses, it's very useful to have this this tool at hand. But I think also it helps us to see this connectivity of these textual communities with each other, and situate the Ismaili Da'is in this larger context of scholarly enterprise, and shows how they were selecting their materials, whom they cited, whom they didn't cite, whom they ignored. And also we can see individual authors like Al-Qadi al-Nu'man in his different works, let's say from his legal work or legal compendium, the Code, the Aim al-Islam, to his Ta'wil al-Dawaim, to Asas al-Ta'wil, and his book of Sharh al-Akhbar, you can see how he's selecting for someone who is studying Al-Qadi al-Nu'man. It gives him more direct access to the mode of working, how you can visualize and see him, how he's selecting his material, how he's what's his method of working, what books he's citing for, let's say in Asas al-Ta'wil, and what he's citing, let's say in Sharh al-Akhbar. Yeah, so my concluding remark is that I was able to show, or I hope to show that this to signal also within Fatimid studies this move from printed culture of reading and research to, I think, increasingly digital methods, because we all read from screens. Increasingly, we talk over screens. We do calculations and search within our text within screens. So I signal this by also exposing many of you colleagues and also listeners to this sort of research or digital humanities methods. But also, I would argue that this gives us more direct access to the texts and to the manuscript tradition, including, I mean, to the pre-modern written culture, to the modes of transmission, copying, and compiling, as well as to their context by linking the text to their context, to the places, persons, communities, and events that we may not suspect otherwise. I hope this will help us to reflect on the questions that were already raised by many panelists yesterday and today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aslisho. Thank you.
So very nice to be here, but I really wish we were all in person because there's so much to exchange and we haven't seen each other for so long. I hope this does not last, but in any case, as a stopgap, it's nice that we can get together even in this manner. So we have 4 speakers, and the first is Miriam Alí-de-Unzaga. So we'll let Miriam go ahead.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to have been invited. I can tell you that I haven't talked to people for a long, long time. So I have a little bit of a deficit. I have to put my walk. I have a lot of things to say, so I have to be very economical. Well, I put the map is not as nice as the previous speaker, but it's just to give an idea in thinking about cosmopolitanism. And I'm not going to talk about cosmopolitanism as a matter of fact, because it made me think, you know, and I'm still have to clarify my ideas on that. Nevertheless, we have a map there, so we see the status. This is around the year 2000, when it's the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate. And I'm going to be talking about the Abbasid as much as the Fatimids in my talk. Now, before I start, I need to say, I just need sort of some minutes to put forward my inquiry. Of course, thanks to the seminal work of scholars such as Ivanov, Stern, Hamdani, Daftary, and yourself, Paul, as well as others, today we know much more about the Fatimid Dawa than 20 years ago. Of course, I'm not an expert on the Dawa, but I'm doing my best. It's very auspicious to be in a panel with an expert on Dawa, so I don't have to really say a lot about this. However, I would like to say just a couple of points, very general points. And we know that the Dawa was a concept that it appears in connection first to the Prophet Muhammad, as he's the Dawa of Allah, and therefore he's the first Da'i. We also know that the notion of Dawa existed in the Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphates, but the Ismaili Dawa called itself Dawa al-Hadiyya, or the rightly guiding. The Ismaili Dawa took place during pre-Fatimid, Fatimid, and post-Fatimid periods, but for the purpose of this paper, I will focus on the Fatimid Dawa. We also know that the Fatimid Dawa took place inside Fatimid dominions as well as outside Fatimid rule, and in fact, the Dawa achieved particularly success, which as a result outlived the downfall of the Fatimid dynasty. Now, I also have to say, and this is not, I hope it's taken in a good way, I'm very grateful to Paul Walker, because reading an article he wrote in 1983 about the Dawa at the time of Al-Hakim really gave me the framework and, you know, the thread to think about things. I'm going to quote him. I'm going to quote you, but not literally, so apologies for that. Paul Walker says, questions about the function of the Ismaili Dawa during the period of Fatimid government constitute an interesting and complex issue. Perhaps the most obvious manifestation concerns the fact that Fatimids did not alter significantly the religious affiliation of those they ruled, for the territories of the Fatimid Empire remain overwhelmingly Sunni. Does this reflect a failure of the proselytizing effort of a government and its highly skilled Dawa to promote a clear Shiite religious agenda? Walker asks as well, was this policy of the Ismaili state to attempt the conversion of the population? So this gave me a lot of food for thought. And now let me move to the notion of material culture and specifically textiles. And this is a notion that has already been studied by Paula Sanders and Irene Bierman and many others. And namely, the thing is that they say the conferment of textiles of robes of honor was a common courtly ritual in the medieval Islamic world, where the ruler affirmed his authority within the hierarchy structure of the court while reinforcing his subjects' loyalty. To me, this is a very good way of formulating such an issue because, again, quoting Paul Walker, the Fatimids were notorious for the employment of non-Ismailis and even non-Muslims in their administration. Now the question is, did these officers understood their function as part of the Ismaili movement? Did ever those core officials become Ismailis? Is this something that, as far as I know, I've been reading, is not necessarily treated or answered in the sources? In this point is that what I open my inquiry, which is to problematize to what extent did the Fatimid state pursue the conversion of its supporters outside Fatimid dominions. In other words, can we consider that one of the objectives was not to proselytize or convert, but rather to get allies or potential allies to acknowledge and recognize the authority of the Imam Caliph? I'm aware that Daftary and Walker carefully mention the political and religious dimension of the Daʿwa. And this is important to keep in mind, because when Dais are called missionaries or propagandists, these words had so many contemporary implications, and many often see them just as preachers, you know, as preachers that go around the world as the Jesuits did. Of course, each individual Dai had a specific biography, and some Dais were poets, other philosophers, other, yes, preachers, but others were statesmen, or rather, well, I don't know if I'm wrong or not, you tell me, we could refer to them as diplomats or diplomatic agents. Now, as I already say, I'm not an expert on the Daḥwa, but I have found some examples, and since I have to be economical, I would only like to mention 2 examples. One is the case of Ibn Hafsun. Somehow, the Fatimid Daḥwa heard about his predicament in Spain, in Al-Andalus, and that he has expressed sympathy towards the Fatimids. So he received in Barbastro a delegation of 2 Dais, and they brought to him robes of honor. After a while in Spanish historiography, we never hear anything about Ibn Hafsun becoming Ismaili or supporting in any way the Fatimid cause. The second case is the Mu'awwal al-Shīrāzī. When he's summoned to the presence of al-Mustansir Billah, he's provided with clothes adorned with gold and stipends to distribute on his diplomatic mission. And I think I'm already taking a lot of time. So I was going to mention this, his success in dealing with, you know, al-Basarisi, and with, you know, the brother of Tohril Bek, and the result and the success, suppose that the name of the Fatimid Imam Caliph was mentioned in the khutbah at least for a whole year in Baghdad. Now, how am I doing with the time?
You have about 10 minutes left.
Okay, I have to be very quick then. My goodness. Okay, I think I'm going to escape this slide, because this is a box that is in Spain. It has some of the protocols of the ṭirāz. Right. The question is now, how do we relate which kind of robes of honor were used in this Daḥwa context? Again, we don't really know. The sources do not talk about it I mean, they're also very economical in the terms. I mean, they don't mention patterns, or if there were ṭirāz. They don't give us any indication. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to speculate and use a working hypothesis of the types of textiles and ṭirāz that could be used as robes of honor. And forgive me, I'm going to focus on my presentation only on 3 Imam Caliphs, Al-Mu'iz, Al-Aziz, and Al-Hakim bi Amrillah. The first one, I'm sorry, I'm going to introduce you to a very boring ṭirāz, which is probably is the standard idea that many people have. You know, it's a very, you know, kind of like, you know, uneventful. I'm not going to read it, but I would just say that, well, I'm going to read it. The ṭirāz says, praise be to God, the dominion is God, the merciful, the compassionate. God benedictions upon his prophet Muhammad, seal of the prophets, assistant from God, and speedy victory and blessings and gratitude to the servant of God, Mahad Abu Tamid al-Mu'iz Lidin Allah, commander of the faithful, God benedictions upon him. This was made in the private factory in Misr. We have around 30 ṭirāz made for Al-Mu'iz, and the only thing is that they have been neglected. And I'm just presenting this example very quickly. I'm not going to read it because it has a lot of text, but I just can tell you that it was published by Marzouk in the 50s. He read it, and then this ṭirāz is dated to 345, so 13 years before the entering in Egypt. This textile didn't really catch a lot of attention among the scholars. They simply thought, well, maybe the Imam Khalif, the Fatimid Imam Khalif, went to other places to look for weavers, in this case embroideries, but very few people realized that there was a ṭirāz in Ifriqiya. We already have an example with the Marwan ṭirāz. Of course, each workshop or each factory had a different style. And I forgot to tell you that I call this style, the red one, I call it sharp. This one I call it elongated, and this one I call it the swan neck. And after dealing with textiles for more than 2 decades, I just feel that I have to give them some, I think I'm entitled to give them some classification. So this ṭirāz is made, as you see, silk and linen tapestry. This style was also, and it's not once, I mean, it's used several times. This ṭirāz, this type of ṭirāz was used by his son, and sorry, I'm just, can you see the inscription? Because I think I have my rule on the top. Okay. Oh, I have a problem, sorry. Okay. By Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, and by the way, I have to tell you that most of the, I mean, I would only be showing you 2 textiles outside of Egypt, and I'm going to take too much to explain why, but if there is time in the questions, I will explain that there's a big caveat, because all the extant textiles are coming from burial sites in Egypt, and of course this conditions our perception of what ṭirāz and robes of honor and textiles in general were used. So this was excavated in Nubia, and I think it's quite a nice example. That is found in Qasr al-Imri, together with 4 embroideries with the name of Al-Hakim. Al-Hakim had used the style, and what I have to show you in this slide is, interestingly, the style was initiated at the time of Al-Muti. So it is something that the Imam Caliphs embraced and used, and it was absolutely the same style. I show you another example where you can see that there was not only ṭirāz, but some decoration as well. I hope this is not disturbing for some people, but one of the I think it was mentioned by Pradins, Istabal al-Antar in Cairo. I think this is Tom 49. This person was in his burial with 3 or 4 ṭirāz, as well as the one around his head. I put another picture so you can read it. So this style, that is, I call it the elongated one, has been argued by Guéraud that is an Abbasid ṭirāz. So I had multiple discussions with him, and I even went to Istabal al-Antar. He invited me there very kindly, but it was impossible to see the place where this ṭirāz has been located. Anyway, his reason for claiming that this ṭirāz is Abbasid is because the style I have been able to read it, and I think it says in the visible parts, may God bless Muhammad, the seal of the prophets, and his complete family, and Nāṣir min Allah, assistance from God. This image has made me think a lot and has brought me to think. Now, I want to show you the example where Guaidó and others consider that this style, which started around the time of Al-Muqtadir, we have, despite the problematic and reign of Al-Muqtadir, there are hundreds of textiles with this style. And whenever somebody sees the style, considers it is Al-Muqtadir. So this continued with his descendants. And there is a very interesting story, because these textiles are painted on cotton. They have also been forgotten. I just put 4 here, but they are a considerable number. They are made on cotton, and therefore textile scholars consider they were not made in Egypt, because Egypt had not cotton. Anyway, I'm not going to go into the discussion of techniques, which is important, but I don't have time to go into that. The thing is that these painted textiles have the sentence of Nāṣir min Allah wa Fatah Qarib in all of them. So already, you know, Kühnel and Bellinger, Deborah Thompson and Tom Giddens and Arabis are saying, you know, it's interesting that, you know, they have the Fatimid motto, but they are made with the style of the Abbasid. Now, I'm going to introduce you another piece, sorry, this one, which is a marriage contract. This is at the time of Al-Muqtadir. It has been published by Yusuf Raghib in the 80s. And he said it's silk that has been glazed. And as you can see, it is the same style that was used at the time of Al-Muqtadir. It continued more than 100 years later. It is true that we see very few of these elongated style that could be produced on the Fatimid context. And to finish my presentation, I close with a question. Could it be that Al-Mu'iz, Al-Aziz, and Al-Hakim embrace the proportionate script, and I take this term from Marina Russo when she talks about Fatimid chancellery, for the diplomatic and political aspects of the Daḥwa? So when we have a dye going into non-Fatimid dominions, they are embracing the style of, you know, the prestigious style that was around during the Fatimids. I mean, I'm just thinking myself, what would do the brother of Tuqid braid, or you know, the Tuqid, or the Samanids that you know, are accepting the legitimacy of the Imam, of the Caliph Imam, but what would they do with these robes? Would they wear them? Would they put them in their houses? Would they just store them? Can we consider that, you know, the at least these 3 Imams, Al-Mu'iz, Al-Aziz, and Al-Hakim, are accommodating and adapting to, you know, to the style that it was already known. So when they take the robes of honor to non-Fatimid dominions, are going to be used and are going to be accepted as, you know, part of a script that is already has a prestigious connotation and is known by those people who the Daesh want to make alliances with and want to recognize the legitimacy of the Imam. And I leave you with this question. I also wanted to say, do I have 1 minute more?
Well, we're almost out.
Okay. This is a complete, it's a different style. It's a complete text. which is a fantastic piece. As you can see, you know, I already have a meter, you know, it's something that is like this by like this. And if you see the workmanship, one, you know, I started to read the book of Gifts and Rarities again, and one is overwhelmed by the quantities and the gold, you know, and the sophistication and the richness. And of course, when you go to this linen embroidered, which are quite honest but magnificent in the, you know, in the workmanship, I think still is necessary that we take the information that the textiles give us, not only the messages of the inscription, but the form and the materials and the techniques. And I'm really sorry that I couldn't really talk about this material aspect, but I feel that I'm going to be talking for the whole hour, and I think we can.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Miriam, and wonderful slides and good examples to look at and think about. So now we turn to Shafiq Virani. So Shafiq, please take over.
Thanks very much, Professor Walker. The Gospel of John reports an intriguing conversation between Jesus and his disciple Nicodemus. Nicodemus was a Pharisee, a member of a Jewish sect known for rigorously observing the strictures and rituals of the traditional and written law, or what in Islamic terms might be called the Sharia. Acknowledging a statement of his pupil, Jesus replied, "Very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again." "How can someone be born when they are old?" Nicodemus asked. "Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb to be born." Jesus answered, "Very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they are born of water and the Spirit." John chapter 3, verses 3-5. This profound dialogue looms large in Christian consciousness. Esoteric commentators drew a distinction between Nicodemus's literal understanding of being born again and the spiritual meaning intended by Jesus. Bernard Lefroy, for example, observes that Jesus, quote, makes it clear that it has nothing to do with the ordinary birth in a carnal manner. This birth is of the Spirit, unquote. This passage is commonly associated with the sacrament of baptism, the initiation into the Christian faith. Michael Pepard, professor of theology at Fordham University, comments on how the reference to both the substance of water and the imagery of the Spirit, quote, generates an image of divine begetting that is both sacramental and sapiential. An image of divine begetting that is both sacramental and sapiential. This parallel of sacrament and sapience, of ritual performance invested with a deeper spiritual meaning and wisdom, was equally a hallmark of Fatimid thought. For example, in his Da'aim al-Islam, or Pillars of Islam, the learned Fatimid jurist Al-Qadi al-Nu'man explains the particulars and specifications of the 7 sacred pillars in detail. However, the Da'aim is accompanied by another book, the Ta'wil Da'aim al-Islam, or esoteric interpretation of the pillars of Islam. This latter tome elucidates the spiritual meaning of all the holy rites. Similarly, in his Ar-Risala al-Wadiyah, or pure epistle on the guideposts and principles of religion, Kirmānī arranges his discussion based on the 2 types of ibadah, or worship, al-ibadah al-amaliyah and al-ibadah al-ilmiyah. The worship by action and the worship by knowledge, direct parallels to the sacrament and sapience mentioned by Michael Pepard. It should therefore come as no surprise that the Fatimids took interest in this passage from the Bible. Their knowledge of earlier revelations was unusual for their time. The aforementioned Kirmānī, for example, quotes directly from pre-Islamic scriptures in his works, the Torah in Hebrew and the Gospels in Syriac. Such interests among the Fatimid Da'is testify to the cosmopolitanism of their worldview. In today's short presentation, I'll share with you 2 examples of the shared symbol of being born and being born again. The first example comes from the writings of Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yemen, one of the earliest Fatimid authors whose works have been preserved. And the second example will touch briefly on the esoteric interpretation or ta'wil of the 7 stages of birth found in the Qur'an, as elucidated by several Fatimid Ismaili da'is. Professor Antonella Straffas of the University of Naples in Italy and I are currently preparing the first critical edition and English translation of the esoteric interpretation of the purifying tribute, or ta'wil al-zakat, by Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yemen. In this side, you can see a beautiful manuscript of the text preserved at Leiden University. The Fatimid savant, Ja'far ibn Mansur, alludes directly to the exchange with Nicodemus in this work. In the first section of the 2nd chapter, he explains that the purifying tribute, zakat, is only on 3 types of animals: camels, cattle, and sheep. This is because these 3 symbolize the speakers, the foundations, and the imams, the 3 ranks of the spiritual hierarchy who never die, for they are given life by the Holy Spirit, Ruh al-Qudus. They have attained the degree of certainty and the angelic realm, or malakut. In this presentation, we'll only have time to speak of the first symbol, the camel. While the camel carries heavy burdens across the desert, God says in the Quran, chapter 73, verse 5, that he has cast a weighty word upon the prophet, and that the prophet must bear this. This is the knowledge of esoteric interpretation, which only the prophet and the chosen among his progeny may carry. It encompasses pure knowledge of divine unity, or tawheed, and the way stations of the spiritual hierarchy. Like the camels, whose duty it is to carry the physical burdens to their destination, the prophets must bear the tanzil, the weighty burden of God's word for their communities, prescribing for them the performance of the outward rites of their respective shari'as. Through these rites, people can reach the inner reality and intention of the performances. Nāṣir-i Khusraw, writing in Persian, discusses the same symbol in his Face of Religion, or Wajid-Dīn. He mentions the unique characteristic that allows the camel to bear its burdens across vast expanses: the fact that it accumulates fat on its back, which forms its hump. The back in Arabic is called dhar, from the same root as dhahir. The meaning of this is that the prophet collects wisdom in the dhahir, or outward form of the prophetic dispensation, the Sharia. Ja'far ibn Mansur describes the external form of the sacraments as being like the body. However, the body must be vivified by the spirit, the sapience of knowledge that animates these rituals and gives them life and value. He continues, saying that the prophets therefore accept the first oath, al-ahad al-awwal, from their communities. However, it's the task of his successor, the Lord of Interpretation, to accept the second oath, or bay'ah, from the community. While the first oath was for the tanzil, or the external form of the revelation, the second oath is for the ta'wil, or esoteric interpretation, in which is, quote, the perfection of religion and completion of favors upon the Muslims, for it is eternal life. The wording here is certainly inspired by the Quran, in a verse believed by the Shia to have been revealed immediately after the declaration of Ali, the Sahib al-Ta'wil, at Ghadir Khum. Al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum wa atmamtu alaykum ni'mati. This day have I perfected for you your religion and completed my favors upon you. He then writes, quote, through it, i.e. the ta'wil, they arrive at knowledge of reality, which is what is alluded to and is spoken of in mysteries by the prophets. And this is the second oath, al-ahad al-thani, by the second birth, which is spiritual, al-wilada al-thaniya al-ruhaniya. It is here, in speaking of the second spiritual birth, that Ja'far ibn Mansur cites the words of Jesus. He writes, quote, it is related that the Messiah said to his disciple, he who is not born twice is not from me, nor am I from him. He is free of me, and I am free of him. Like many Christian commentators, Ja'far ibn Mansur views the second birth as spiritual, while the first birth is an oath accepting the outward form of the prophet's message. The second oath involves accepting its inner meaning as taught by the asas and the imams. This is the all-important second spiritual birth spoken of by Jesus. It is not only the concept of the second birth in Fatimid thought that resonates with esoteric interpretations in Christianity, but the concept of the second oath. No less a figure than the 3rd century Tertullian, known as the father of Latin Christianity, derived the ecclesiastical Latin word sacramentum, itself a translation of the Greek New Testament word mysterion, from the oath of allegiance. This word referred to the oath pledged by ancient Roman soldiers, and Tertullian argued that just as this covenant was the sign of beginning a new life, the sacrament of baptism initiated Christians into a new life. This combination of initiation into esoteric mysteries, sealed by the pledge of a sacred oath, is equally reflected in the writings of Ja'far ibn Mansur. Moving on to our second example, and from the Bible to the Qur'an, a famous passage describes the creation of the human form in 7 stages in the womb. 1, we created man from a quintessence of clay. 2, then we placed him, a drop, in a secure receptacle. 3, then we made the drop a clot. 4, then we made the clot a lump. 5, then we made the lump bones. 6, then we garmented the bones with flesh. And most importantly, 7, then we produced him as another creation. In the 7th stage, the human being emerges as another creation. Thanks to the labors of our panel's chair, Dr. Paul Walker, along with Professor Wilfred Madelung, we now have an excellent critical edition of Abu Yaqub Sijistani's Proofs of Prophecy, or Ithbat an-Nubuwat. In this work, the author explains how these cycles in the womb parallel the cycles in the womb of time. Each cycle, or dawr, is marked by the coming of a natiq. Parallel to the clay is Adam, to the drop is Nuh, to the clot is Ibrahim, to the lump is Musa, to the bones is Isa or Jesus, and to the flesh is Muhammad. The 7th and final stage, however, is the emergence from the womb, the arrival of the Qa'im as another creation, one who does not bring a sharia, but who reveals the spiritual meaning of all the sharias. In a seminal article, the Venerable Dr. Walker writes, quote, in a sense, this image pictures mankind waiting now in a pregnant universe for the ultimate upheaval which will deliver him from the womb of history. What is notable in such understandings is that the dispensations of earlier messengers are not annulled or negated by their successors. Rather, they are completed and brought to the next level of perfection. As Toby Meyer has demonstrated, this is amply discussed in the writings of Shahrastani, who incidentally uses precisely the Fatimid example of the stages of development in the womb. This provides a novel understanding of the concepts of nasikh and mansukh, or abrogating and abrogated signs of God. The sharia that is abrogated is not annulled, but confirmed and brought to the next stage of perfection. The further perfected form is dependent on its predecessor. Shahrastani writes, quote, never hold the opinion that one prophetic dispensation is negated by another, or that its injunctions are annulled and others laid down. This process continues from the time of Adam until the advent of the Qa'im, who is another creation. He tells us that this comparison of the 7 stages of the physical birth are parallel to the 7 stages of spiritual birth, because the process of the creation of physical things, or khalqiyat, parallels the creation of matters of the divine command, or amriyat. Just as the physical development of the child through 6 stages in the womb is fruitless unless the birth takes place as the culminating 7th stage, the succeeding prophetic sharias are fruitless without the Qa'im, or another creation. In his Repose of the Intellect, or Rahat al-Aql, Hamid al-Kirmānī compares the physical progression with the progression of the soul. He indicates that the quintessence of clay is the mixture of temperaments and the cause for the existence of the soul, whose birth resembles how fire blazes forth from coal, ignited by a single ember. The drop corresponds with the faculty of growth, like plants. Then comes the faculty of sensation, like that in the lower animals. The capacity of the souls of higher animals of imagination, or takhayyul, the lower human capacity for reasoned speech, nāṭiqa, through which human beings may learn of the separated celestial intellects, and sixth, the higher perception of the intellects and their ranks. Through this may occur the highest stage, the seventh, what Kirmānī calls the second creation, perfection, and the second culmination, after which there is no further culmination. It corresponds to the soul's return to the supreme intellect of the abode of origination. The metaphysical anaphora continues in the writings of Al-Muʻayyad, who brings us back to the sacraments with which we began. According to Al-Muʻayyad, the Prophet revealed 7 pillars in stages. The first 6 were in order: purification, prayer, the purifying tribute, fasting, pilgrimage, and the righteous struggle. You will notice that all 6 of these are actions to be performed, sacraments or amal. These are Islam. The last one, corresponding to another creation, is spiritual, as it involves sapience or ilm. It is the walaya revealed at Ghadir Khum that encompasses the ta'wil, that is another creation, or khalq akhir. According to Al-Muʻayyad, just as the progress of 6 stages in the womb are miscarried if the 7th stage or birth does not take place, the performance of the 6 sacraments are miscarried if the 7th and final stage, the walaya, is lost. This is the spiritual birth. The bodily form of surah jismaniya is the result of physical birth and is nourished by the physical world. Meanwhile, the form that transpires from the angelic world, or surah malakutiya, is the result of the spiritual birth and is nourished by God's hierarchy. In this context, the Ismaili da'is regularly refer to a tradition of the Prophet. O Ali, you and I are the parents of this community. Thus, in the major cycle, the Natik and the Asas are the spiritual father and mother. And in the minor cycle, the Imam and his Hujjah are the spiritual father and mother. They nourish the spiritual children with knowledge so that they rise higher. Al-Mu'ayyad cites one of the Imams who compares the physical child with the spiritual child. When the physical children are infants, they are nearly helpless and remain weak while in childhood. Similarly, the mustajibs or respondents are in their spiritual childhood. Their capacities are limited and not yet capable of understanding knowledge of divine things, al-ma'lumat al-ilahiyya. However, when they are nurtured and ascend to the rank of youth, they attain recognition of the Imam. In this paper, we've recalled a famous passage in the Bible in which Jesus explains to Nicodemus the importance of being born again. This passage is directly alluded to and expounded upon in the writings of Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yemen. In so doing, we can trace many similarities between esoteric Islam and esoteric Christianity in understanding this profound concept, and also observe the cosmopolitan outlook of the Fatimid da'is. He took immense interest in the spiritual traditions of other communities. We then continued by examining Fatimid interpretations of a Quranic passage that discusses a journey through the womb in 6 stages, culminating in the birth of another creation in the 7th. This passage is viewed in spiritual terms, whether the creation of the spiritual universe in 6 stages, culminating in the 7th in the arrival of the Qa'im, of the human soul in 6 stages, culminating in the 7th in the soul's return to the abode of its origin, or in the progression of the 6 sacraments of Fatimid Islam, culminating in the sapience of the 7th, in the walaya that reveals to the faithful the spiritual meaning of the revelation. Were today's conference not limited to the period of the Fatimids, we may have added another section about the concept of spiritual birth in Satpant, or South Asian Ismailism. Bir Sadr-Din, for example, writes in a Ginan.
We need to close here.
Last sentence. Eji jema jema jugata suprita kareva bhai prita kareva bhai tema tema rayana vyani. As you harness the mind and remember the divine name with love, as you remember the divine name with love, dear brother, so shall the darkness of night give birth to the light. Such an inquiry would, if you'll excuse the pun, be pregnant with possibilities. However, that is another topic for another conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Shafiq. Very nice. Very interesting topic. it needs much more exploration, and I think there's a lot more material. So now we turn to Khalil and Danny. Khalil, are you there? And you can take over, please.
All right, I think everybody's with me. So good morning to all of you. It's a delight to be here. Thank you to the Institute of Ismaili Studies. And thank you especially to the convener, Gregory, for graciously inviting me to the conference and keeping me updated with every step of the process. I'm a little bit nervous being on a panel. When I saw the names on my panel, I thought there was a mistake. So it's an honor to be in the company of everybody else. I also think this whole thing flows very nicely. Dr. Shafiq Virani has talked about the concept of spiritual birth in Fatimid thought. And it's important to point out that everything that's been shared so far, it only makes sense when it is situated within an underlying metaphysics and theology. If there is no underlying theological vision, then these ideas of spiritual and physical birth, they just sound very nice and poetic. But they don't correspond to reality. And sort of my presentation today is focused on this latter issue. What is the metaphysical vision that animated much of Fatimid and post-Fatimid era Ismaili thought? So the topic is Neoplatonism. My proposal is that Ismaili Neoplatonism, far from being a sectarian marketing ploy, was actually the vision that animated Ismaili thought in the Fatimid and post-Fatimid eras. And it was ultimately prevalent because it provided the Ismaili thinkers, as well as some non-Ismaili thinkers, with what they thought to be the most coherent, rational explanation for our experience of reality in all its different dimensions. So let me begin by just defining what do we mean by Neoplatonism, because Neoplatonism is a modern academic category. None of these thinkers called themselves Neoplatonists or anything like that. The labeling is modern, but this labeling refers to, in the words of Dermot Moran, the quote, longest and most enduring intellectual tradition in the history of philosophy, and yet perhaps the most neglected. So what do we mean by Neoplatonism? And I put sort of this on the screen here for you. Let me summarize it. So I would define it, Ismaili Neoplatonism, which is a particular flavor of this, as a metaphysics that posits a absolutely transcendent, ineffable God. You can see that in the diagram. God's eternal creative action as the divine word or command, that arrow. The universal or first intellect as the first created, perfect, contingent being. So the first intellect is, although perfect, it is dependent on God. The universal soul as the second contingent being and demiurge, so the direct creator of the reality we experience, and a hierarchy consisting of spiritual and material worlds. Now, apart from this, there are many details in a Neoplatonic system that different thinkers iron out in different ways. We all know that Kirmānī's 10 intellect model differed from the model of Sijistani and Nāṣir Khusraw and others. So just to put that out there. So, but let's talk about how Ismaili Neoplatonism has been framed in modern scholarship so far. If I were to generalize, I would say that most modern scholars, with a few exceptions, have branded this as, not their words, but in my words, a marketing strategy. So in terms of where did this whole idea come from? Kareem Douglas Crowe, in his study of the concept of Aql and the thought of Jafar Sadiq, the fifth Imam of the Shia, Kareem Douglas Crowe has argued that actually Imam Jafar Sadiq, interacting with both Islamic and non-Islamic sources in his own time, that Imam Jafar Sadiq actually taught that God created the Aql, intellect, as the first spiritual entity, the first of the Ruhaniyin. So some of the ideas of Ismaili Neoplatonism may actually go back to earlier Imams, because they are found in non-Ismaili Shi'i traditions. Who are the earliest Ismaili Neoplatonists? Sort of the jury's still out on that one. We have at least two groups that seem independent that are espousing Neoplatonic vision, the Brethren of Purity. They may be pre-Fatimid, there may be early Fatimid, and then the Iranian Dais, Nasafi, Razi, Sijistani, who are in basically Khorasan, Central Asia. So we don't have a full origin story, but we have speculation as to sort of what the origin story, could be. So it is claimed that Imam al-Mu'iz initially disapproved of Neoplatonism and that he changed his mind. And most of the explanations have been about why did he change his mind and why was this worldview adopted? And to summarize some of the explanations here, most of them posit that the Ismaili Dais originally, the Iranian Dais, who didn't recognize the Fatimids, and even later Dais under al-Mu'iz's permission, it is proposed that the main motivator was to attract and convert a certain group of people. It could be the court elite in Central Asia, and the theory is that Imam al-Mu'iz then changed his mind and allowed Neoplatonism, so his Daʿwa could basically appeal and convert the Eastern Ismailis, the Iranian Ismailis. So this is the marketing strategy theory of Ismaili Neoplatonism. Not everyone holds this, but it's the popular view. So even David Hollenberg, David Hollenberg tweaks the view a little bit. He says that al-Mu'iz and his Dais adopted Neoplatonism to polemicize against the Iranian Dais, but it's either marketing or counter-marketing. Now, why do people hold this narrative? So you have a account where it is a report from Qadi Numan where Imam al-Mu'iz meets a Dai from the East. And we're told in the account that the Dai from the East mixed the views of the falasifa with the teachings of religion. And Imam al-Mu'iz was not impressed with that. Now, here's the problem. That has been taken to mean evidence that Imam al-Mu'iz rejected Neoplatonism initially. I would propose that this is not true. That account is an account of Imam al-Mu'iz disapproving of falsafa and the views of the falasifa. And falsafa is not the same thing as the Ismaili brand of Neoplatonism that even the Iranian Dais like Sijistani and Razi talk about. They never call their views falsafa. They actually polemicize against falsafa. Falsafa being a type of Neoplatonized Aristotelian Islamized tradition of philosophy that explicitly dispenses with the concept of imamate as Ismailis understand it. So I'd propose that the whole narrative that Imam al-Mu'iz disapproved of Neoplatonism, I don't think that narrative is accurate, and I think we need to sort of reopen that question. In either case, what I'm proposing is, regardless of the origin, Neoplatonic metaphysics served as the inner kernel, as the substance of Ismaili teaching in the Fatimid and in the post-Fatimid eras. It was not merely a cosmetic shell that Ismailis used to reach out to certain groups. Neoplatonism also had a cosmopolitan appeal beyond Fatimid Ismaili circles, as we'll see. But most importantly, it provided a rational explanation of reality as the Ismaili thinkers experienced that reality. So I'm just going to go through some examples to show the first point. How could we say that it's really the inner kernel? Essentially, what I'm going to try to show with just a couple, 2-3 examples is a given Ismaili thinker, Sijistani does this, Nāṣir Khusraw does this, but a given Ismaili thinker has weaved the Neoplatonic worldview, the worldview that you see here. He's weaved this worldview in such a deep way in all aspects of Ismaili religious belief that it's impossible at this time to not be a Neoplatonist and accept Ismaili theological positions. So let me try to show you that. So Tawheed, right? I would propose that the Ismaili theology of Tawheed was internally Neoplatonized, even by the time of Sijistani and Razi and Nasafi, although they're the earliest ones. So this was the only way they could hold to the Ismaili position on Tawheed. Let me give you an example. So here you have a quote from Al-Mu'iyyad al-Shīrāzī, quoted in a later source, but he's very clear that God cannot be described with any name or attribute. You cannot call God living, knowing, powerful, complete, perfect. So this is the Ismaili sort of apophaticism. The thing is that you can't hold to this apophaticism if you don't have something like a Neoplatonic hierarchy that has been created by God, where you can legitimately refer positive or cataphatic descriptions, right? The Quran talks about, different divine names. So if you maintain that God is beyond names, you need to do something with the divine names in scripture and ritual. You can't just belie them or negate them and leave it at that. This is where the Neoplatonic worldview comes in. The Neoplatonic worldview gave Ismailis a metaphysical infrastructure by which they completely defined their theology and their hermeneutics. Let's consider a very common question, a question that philosophers of religion still debate today. So Nāṣir-i Khusraw was asked, was God the creator and the sovereign? These are referring to divine names translated in Persian. Was God the creator and the sovereign before he created the creatures? Right? Before creation, can you still call God the creator? Because there's no creation. So how did Nāṣir-i Khusraw answer this? The only way he can answer it is by recourse to the Neoplatonic structure of reality. He says, and this is just an excerpt, he says that the sovereign, right, the Malik, the Padshah, is not actually God, it's the first intellect. And the creator or the maker of the world is not directly God, it's the universal soul. He goes on to say that the only reason that we attribute creatorship and sovereignty to God is because the intellect and the soul are originated by God's command. And we're only attributing these names to God in an honorific sense. So this is just to diagram it for you, right? So the divine names like sovereign and creator, and I could actually go through a whole list of names with someone. All of these divine names are reassigned from God to the Neoplatonic hypostases, namely the intellect and the soul. Now, if you take away the Neoplatonic hypostases, if you just have a more of a Sunni theology where it's God and the material world, the Ismailis would run into problems. They would not be able to maintain an apophatic theology and hermeneutically deal with the language of scripture and prayer if they don't have a mediating Neoplatonic archetypes that actually hold those divine names and make the whole religious theology coherent. So that's why the Neoplatonism is indispensable. This is not a marketing ploy anymore. Prophecy. The whole concept of Nabuwa was reconceived on clearly Neoplatonic grounds. You have passages from Ithbat Nabuwa that Professor Walker has kindly edited for us a few years ago with very useful text. Sijistani's whole concept of prophecy has recourse to the Neoplatonic structure of reality, and it's a really, really, cool, you could say, both naturalistic and metaphysical account of prophecy. So what I'm about to say is in there, but I'll use Nāṣir-i Khusraw as a more recent example. So Nāṣir-i Khusraw in Khan al-Ikhwan defines risalat, messengership, prophethood. And he clearly talks about here that how is it that you have someone called a prophet? Why isn't everybody a prophet? Why is it only one person a prophet? And Nāṣir-i Khusraw explains that what happens is that there's a particular kind of human soul that becomes receptive to the influence or the emanation of the universal soul. So that soul that receives emanation from the universal soul, Nāṣir-i Khusraw says, that soul is, quote, the messenger, Peygambar, Rasul of the universal soul. So the whole concept of a Rasul by Nāṣir-i Khusraw is redefined. The prophet is not the direct messenger of God, because God transcends time, space, and description. The prophet is the messenger of the universal soul, and he transmits the emanation of the universal soul to other souls. So that's how prophecy is being defined. It's a clearly Neoplatonic dependent account of prophecy. So again, if you say, let's just, this is just marketing and we can just dispense with the hierarchy, then you don't have an Ismaili account of prophecy that also accords with the Ismaili view of God, right? So a Neoplatonic type hierarchy is necessary. Now, what they also do, interestingly, is the Neoplatonic terminology is universal, right? Aqlikul, nafsikul, non-Ismailis are using these ideas too. So what the Ismailis do is they match the particular Quranic terminology with the universal. Okay, so kalam, pen, Lao, tablet, wahi, tanzil, these are all matched. They're all correlated with certain Neoplatonic processes. So what that does is it universalizes the message of Islam, and it universalizes Ismaili theology. So someone who's not Ismaili, who's maybe not even Muslim, they could totally relate to what's going on here. So this is about having a universal, not a sectarian model of reality. All right, one last example of sort of how important this is. So prayer, how does prayer work? Again, there's recourse to the Neoplatonic structure to explain prayer. So broadly speaking, Abu Yaqub as-Sijistani writes in Ithbat an-Nabuwa that the Quranic recitation and bodily gestures in the salah, in the namaz, symbolize the universal soul's reception of emanation from the universal intellect. So broadly speaking, prayer is the act of the worshiper imitating the universal soul. And that's a very Neoplatonic idea. The universal soul is in motion, it's acting, it's trying to perfect itself. So the worshiper who does the namaz is actually imitating the universal soul. Again, if you take away that idea, you don't have a proper account of prayer anymore. Specific gestures in prayer. So when you do the ruku, the bowing, you recite Subhana Rabbi al-Azim. Okay, so that divine name, right, Rabbi al-Azim, what does that mean? Nāṣir Khusraw Wajiddin tells us that the divine name al-Azim in the prayer, it refers to the universal soul. And likewise, the divine name al-Ahla, when you do sujud, when you do prostration, the al-Ahla, that divine name refers to the universal intellect. So this is a thoroughly Neoplatonic account of prayer. And again, the overall goal of worship, of ibadah in all its forms, according to Nāṣir-i Khusraw, is to become like the universal soul. So like soteriology has been conceived alongside or in the context of a Neoplatonic vision of reality. So what's the legacy of this? Well, in the early period, the blue, like here are the blue names. These are referring to Ismaili sources where I have tracked the presence of Neoplatonic thinking. I hope you can all see this doesn't stop at the Fatimid period. Everybody likes to say that it stopped at the Fatimid period and then the Nizaris are doing something else. This is not the case. It continues in the Al-Muḥayyad period. It continues in the post-Al-Muḥayyad period. Some of the forms change and some of the applications change, but the Neoplatonic structure continues to provide the kernel of Ismaili theological thinking. I could even show you that we have contemporary Ismailis who are Neoplatonists and who are continuing that tradition. We even have a case, Dr. Virani has edited this text, where one of the Nizari Imams, Imam Abdus Salam, from his own mouth, you have a summary articulation of this Neoplatonic thinking, Imam Abdus Salam living sometime in the 15th century. So this Neoplatonic orientation has actually endured within the Nizari tradition. And if we sort of zoom out a little bit more, here are some other names who are not Ismaili, who use Neoplatonic ideas in their poetry or in their prose. These are the names in black. So that's why I said the Neoplatonic dimension of Fatimid thought is cosmopolitan. And it's cosmopolitan because it actually had all this influence and staying power even beyond Ismaili circles. Now, how was it used beyond Ismaili circles?
We need to come to an end here.
Yeah, this is the last slide. So here's a quick summary, right? I'm not saying everybody after the Fatimid era uses the Neoplatonic ideas in the same way. They don't, but I've sort of summarized for you here. Ghazali will use it for his own purpose. Shahrastani's works, his tafsir, is suffused with Neoplatonic ideas. His ta'wil of the letters, the holy letters, is clearly Neoplatonic. There's other examples here. You'll find this in the poetry of Jalaluddin Rumi, post-Al-Muḥayyad Nizari Ismailism. You even have something called Jewish Ismailism, where Jewish thinkers are picking up aspects. So to conclude then, I've tried to argue that Fatimid Neoplatonic thought was both an esoteric theology, it was taught in closed Ismaili circles, but it was universalist and it had cosmopolitan appeal. I've also proposed that the origin story that the Fatimid dyes picked up Neoplatonism as a marketing strategy, that this has to be revised. I think it does not have as much basis as we think. And finally, Neoplatonic understandings of reality, which completely enveloped Ismaili theological understandings, continued strong in the post-Fatimid period. They continue to be strong today. I myself am an advocate of Ismaili Neoplatonism in the contemporary philosophy of religion. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Khalil. It's always nice to have somebody talk about Neoplatonism, as it is one of my favorite topics as well. So now we turn to Jamil. Jamil, are you there? And can you take over, please?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Walker. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I'd like to thank the coordinators of this conference and particularly Professors Bellotto and Jiwa, for all of their hard work in getting us together. No small feat when dealing with so many academics. I'd like to thank the Institute of Ismaili Studies for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be on the same panel with some old friends, Professors Virani and Professor Andani. And it's so nice to meet Professor Alí-de-Unzaga. Over the past 20 years, as I've mentioned earlier, my own work has been heavily indebted to that of Professor Walker. So it's particularly meaningful that he's chairing this panel today. Many of the themes that Professor Virani has spoken about, you'll see resonate in my paper. So I do hope we'll have some time to discuss further. Instead of slides, I thought that you might be able to stare into space. This whole paper is about space, and then you can discover something new in my coffee background as you parallel process Ta'wil and Cosmopolitanism and the Daʿwa. So one of the really exciting elements of this conference is its emphasis on various approaches to Fatimid materials. What I love about analyzing Fatimid texts, particularly texts of Ta'wil, is how they provide opportunities for interpretations at multiple registers. As Professor Walker has pointed out in a recent article, surprisingly, there hasn't been much done on Ta'wil, aside from the recent work of Poonawala and Hollenberg, and we must pay more attention to this modality of interpretation. We also must pay attention to specific examples of this hermeneutic and how this relates to the Fatimids' doctrinal program. Here I'm interested in looking at some of these examples of Ta'wil and the Daʿwa from the prism of space and the sacred, to see what these discussions say about eschatology and cosmopolitanism. For this particular study, I've chosen examples from 3 different texts. The first is from the Kitab al-Kashf, an early text that is correlated to the revolutionary phase of the Fatimids and perhaps edited a bit later. I then examine a few examples of Ta'wil from al-Qadi al-Numan, his foundation of spiritual hermeneutics, or Asasi Ta'wil, and his interpretation of his own book of laws, his Ta'wil al-Daim, which Professor Virani spoke about earlier. I want to look at these examples through the prism of space because I think it provides us with a unique vantage point by which we can begin to correlate aspects of eschatology with Ta'wil and how that might interface with our theme of cosmopolitanism. First, a brief word about space. Here I refer to space through the prism of the study of religion, religion being an eminently social phenomenon, pace Durkheim, that exists and expresses itself in space. According to Knott, quote, the spatial underpinning of religion is witnessed at all levels, from the expression of hierarchical relations to the local, national, and global extension of religious structures and institutions by their repeated reproduction in new settings through mission or migration, end quote. Turning now to the Qur'an, the earliest revelations of the Qur'an discussed a potentially imminent apocalypse. The Qur'an makes its argument through space in quite a number of ways, but one of the most vivid ways it makes its argument is through an ontological reversal of earthly and heavenly space, particularly in the early Meccan surahs. Here, for instance, is the beginning of Surah 82. When the sky is torn, when the stars are scattered, when the seas are poured forth, when the tombs are burst open, then a soul will know what it has given and what it has held back. O human being, what has deceived you about your generous Lord, who created you and shaped you and made you right? And it continues to discuss admission into heaven and hell. It states that those who deny the reckoning, which in this time also meant religion, Deen, will be admitted to hell, while those who embraced it will be admitted to heaven. A cursory spatial reading of the beginning of this surah would note that the space of the apocalypse encompasses the totality of the earth and even beyond, from the highest point of what we can see, the sky and the stars beyond, to what is beneath the earth, the tombs. In other surahs, earthquakes are described. Here the sea is released from its natural order. The earth becomes the locus of the apocalypse's ontological reversal. In Surah 99, the Zalzal, or the quaking earth discloses all the secrets hidden within it, and it will actually be the place where the resurrected are brought into lines. The text says, straggle forth, and shown the true reality of final judgment. The first Fatimid text I wish to discuss harnesses some of the spatial features of the Quranic apocalypse and resignifies them through ta'wil to argue for belief in the eschatological figure. I use the term resignified to denote a dual hermeneutical process, the process of uncovering hidden meanings within the Quranic text through the specification of symbolic reference, a hallmark of ta'wil, and the simultaneous process of crafting new meaning through the narrative identification of the specified reference. These specified reference take on the shape of myth or empirically unverifiable truths through their resignification. This text, the Kitab al-Kashf, is often stridently dualistic, arguing that those who support the advent of the eschatological figure, alternatively known as the Mahdi, the Qa'im, and the Nātikh, will be on the right side of history. The architecture of the Quranic apocalypse is frequently invoked to make this argument in the text, and it is remarkable to see how this is done. One part of the text, for instance, reproduces Quran 55:37, which reads, "And when the heaven is split open and becomes rose-colored like oil," the Kashf states, "and this is how it will be for the Qa'im of truth, by which his world will appear, and the horizon will become radiant for him. Racing ahead will be the people who turn away, but this is the approaching punishment that cannot be prevented." The next page of the text explicitly links the approaching punishment with the Qa'im. The Kashf also states that, quote, "the day of judgment is the manifestation of the Nātikh and his rising," end quote. Those who support this eschatological figure, which includes those who give support to Ali and those imams whom God has rightfully elected, will be ultimately rewarded by the Qa'im's appearance, while those on the wrong side of history will be subjected to his punishment. So there are a few things I wish to point out here. First, note how the text transposes the Quran's apocalyptic architecture to the plane of Fatimid history through this ta'wil, making support for the eschatological figure the ultimate barometer of salvation. Those who follow him will gain salvation, and others who do not will be condemned eternally. Second, and spatially, note how the rose-colored light resulting from the heavens splitting in the Quranic apocalypse actually serves as the light illuminating the visual field for the eschatological figure in the text. This ta'wil of the Quranic apocalypse thus transforms the earth into the locus of the appearance of the Qa'im and his subsequent judgment, the light illuminating the Qa'im's horizon. Over and over again in this text, we also see the resignification of the Quran's apocalyptic architecture as the coming of the eschatological figure. Since the entire earth is the locus of the apocalypse in the Quranic context, earthly topographies like mountains also figure into the Kashf. For instance, after equating the day of judgment to the eschatological figure, the Kashf states, "by whom God sorts between truth and falsehood, believer and denier, and he is an appointed time of God's command and its fulfillment." Our author continues his ta'wil of the surah, "the day the horn is blown," this is from Quran 78:18, "is in actuality the day the Daʿwa is made public, and the mountains are removed and will be but a mirage," from 78:20. Our author equates to the Hujjahs, who will now become subservient to the newly manifested Mahdi. Images of the earth's ontological reversal are thus resignified to foreshadow the coming of the Qa'im. So even when the Kashf is not engaged in a resignification of apocalyptic imagery, its spatial field often concerns the entire earth, anticipating how the Daʿwa may appear and spread freely throughout the world. Since we are in a time of increased awareness of how our behavior has affected shifts in global climate patterns, I thought it would be particularly appropriate to cull an example from the Kashf that speaks about bees. The Quranic verse in question says, quote, "and your Lord inspired to the bees, take for yourselves among the mountains houses," that is, hives, "and among the trees." This is from 1668. The Kashf states, The bees are the imams, the places of God's knowledge, because they are storehouses of God's guidance, hadi, and his light. The mountains are equated to the Dawas, those who are set up as proofs, hujjaj. The Quranic phrase from the trees refers to the Dawas under the hujjaj. The Quranic phrase in that which they construct, or the human-made materials out of which bees make hives, means from that which the Dawas multiply. The text continues, God says to the imams, then feed from the flowers of all kinds of fruits and follow the ways made easy for you by your Lord. That's from 1669. So bees, trellises, trees, hives, and fruits all become the open spatial field of the Ismaili mission. The bees are likened to the imams, the storehouses of God's wisdom. The bees set up hives which are proofs, the hujjaj, which in the kashf may refer to the dignitaries in the hierarchy through whom the imam could become accessible in his absence. Note the order of the hierarchy here. Hives in the trees are a rank lower in the Dawa, and the hives constructed out of human-made materials, perhaps we can say in the midst of the social world, are places where the Dawas multiply. The path that the bees zoom through, the path that God makes easy for the bees, is re-signified as the spatial field for work, the work of religion. The honey that emerges from their bees is tangible evidence for the veracity of this whole system, as in the kashf it points to empirical evidence of the fact that judgment based on true wisdom will separate the people, just as no one can deny that honey is made from bees. If the kashf deploys the earth and its contents as an expansive spatial field for the coming of the eschatological figure in the Dawa, then texts of Ta'wil by Al-Qadi al-Numan do something a bit different in their discussion of space. As we all know, al-Numan's corpus is quite substantial, and so it would be inappropriate to generalize, but I do wish to point to a few examples of how a spatial analysis might aid us in thinking about eschatology and cosmopolitanism. First, in the Asasi Ta'wil, or Foundations of Spiritual Hermeneutics, there's a focus on events that happened during the time of the prophets, such as Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Moses. Indeed, past prophetic history is reread to make the present. Through Ta'wil, these past events acquire meaning that gestures to the establishment of the contemporary architecture of the Dawa. In other words, al-Numan spends a lot of time discussing how events in prophetic history point to the structure and function of the Fatimid hierarchy. One fine example is al-Numan's discussion of Noah's Ark. And here's this. Noah built the ark as an example for a foundation, asas. This is the rank of the Dawa just after the speaker prophet, custodian of the hidden knowledge, of his Dawa, and set up its borders, hudud, to establish the batin by the command of God to save believers through the life of spiritually enlightened knowledge from drowning in ignorance and error, just as the ark in the Dahir is a refuge from the literal drowning. And so, by the asas, he built a foundation for his Dawa and his hudud, and set up the Dawa for believers through the storehouses of hidden knowledge. And he made the manifest ark a proof by which believers are shown the way, and as a likeness for his batin. So we all know the story of the ark as one in which true believers, the minority of people who adhere to God's word, are saved, and the majority of people who refuse to believe in the truth are not. But al-Numan resignifies the story so that the salvific substrate of the ark becomes transformed into spiritually enlightened knowledge. The ark's borders are likened to the batin, to hidden knowledge, and function both as barriers to the outside, to the unsaved masses, and as a hierarchical system of a particular structure ordering that knowledge. Those within the ark are surrounded by and saved through the spiritually enlightened knowledge dispensed by the asas and the Dawa. Indeed, the majority of this text is concerned with ascribing and delineating an esoteric hierarchy to Quranic and extra-Quranic sources. Unlike the kashf, where there's a sense of eschatological urgency and totality of final judgment, here Ta'wil gently hangs over many of these stories. It infuses them, or almost stands parallel to them. While this might be due to a multiplicity of reasons, here I wish to highlight two. The first is the issue of eschatology, that the Fatimids came to power on the heels of an apocalyptic revolution. This reinterpretation of prophetic history might have been a necessary step in articulating the tenets of authoritative structures. In other words, reinterpreting the past and according events with Ta'wil that corresponded to a specific esoteric hierarchy in which particular functions were delineated as the Fatimids' transition from movement to state helped to institutionalize a movement initially grounded in Mahdiist impulse. We know from sociological studies on apocalyptic movements that success of such movements in many cases correlates to how well its authority becomes institutionalized. Here, there may be a necessity to present the past as gesturing to these structures, the structures of salvation through the Daʿwa. Second, the reality of living in a truly cosmopolitan context may have animated Al-Nu'man to continue this Ta'wil tradition in his particular way. We know that he was incredibly busy writing for multiple audiences, Ismaili and non-Ismaili, laying the groundwork for Ismaili law, writings on ritual, and also, of course, Ta'wil. But what is also striking about his work is how he's able to take existing structures on ritual, on sacred spaces, for instance, and construct multiple meetings for multiple audiences at multiple registers. One of my favorite examples is his discussion of the necessity of the pilgrimage of the Da'im and his resignification of it in the Ta'wil al-Da'im. The Da'im al-Islam, which has an entire chapter on the details of pilgrimage, states, for instance, quote, Abu Jafar Muhammad bin Ali, he said, every faithful one who goes around the house, this is the Kaaba, 7 times, prays 2 rak'ah, performs the circumambulation properly, and offers prayers correctly, shall be forgiven his sins by God. And here is how Al-Nu'man talks about this in the Ta'wil al-Da'im. The likeness of the house is the master of the age, whoever is a prophet or an imam. The likeness of circumambulating it is the likeness of the people of the Daʿwa of truth, holding fast to the imam of their time. They're seeking his protection, they're drawing near to him, and they're striving for the grace of God and knowledge and wisdom that he has. The likeness of the person who circumambulates the Kaaba, who in the Dāhir has completed 7 circumambulations, is the likeness of the people of the Daʿwa of truth, acknowledging the 7 speaker prophets and the 7 imams, those imams between each of the 7 speaker prophets who succeeded one another. The text goes on to say that the likeness of the prayer, the salah, is the Daʿwa of truth, and that the 2 rak'ah of circumambulation is the performance of the Dāhir and Batin in the Daʿwa of truth. So correct religion here is mediated by space in both cases. In the first, performing the obligation of the pilgrimage, including the circumambulation of the Kaaba with its attendant prayers correctly, results in the expiation of sins. But in the movement from the Dāhir to the Batin, normative ideas of the sacred center become displaced, or at least infused with alternate meaning. The likeness of the Kaaba transforming into the master of the age means that the sacred center of Islam is now locative. It is in motion. Second, note that the likeness of the circumambulation is actually a reification and reaffirmation of Fatimid authority and sacred history, the acknowledgement of the 7 speaker prophets and 7 imams between them. So the relationship in the Dāhir between seeker and the sacred becomes transformed into the seeker's walaya to a multiplicity of official figures. In addition to constructing a locative center and an official history of those people who served as that center, there is a hierarchy of knowledge too. The 2 rak'ah symbolize the Dāhir and the Batin, and the fact that true knowledge is mediated through this Daʿwa of truth. The Dāhiri periphery and center becomes transformed by Ta'wil into a locative center with a distinct history and hierarchy, dispensing true wisdom, like in the Ark, to true believers, standing parallel with another narrative about the validity of the Dāhiri Hajj. So what can this discussion...
Can you bring to an end here?
Absolutely. So what can this discussion of space tell us about Fatimid religion? First, I think looking at these and other texts through the prism of space can illuminate in very interesting ways certain themes that were interest to certain authors. The cache spatial field is rife with eschatological images, and of course how the ranks of the Daʿwa were going to emerge freely. For Al-Nu'man, discussions of space tell us that when apocalyptic ideas had to be re-narrativized, Ta'wil became more bounded to accommodate the realities of both revised notions of eschatology and the reality of cosmopolitanism. As Nu'man wrote reams of laws for general audiences, this notion of Ta'wil still continued, pointing to the importance of maintaining for believers a special mode of interpretation that powerfully displaced normative understandings of space, attesting to the continued appeal of this hermeneutic and of the forces that issued it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Very nice, very dense, I must say.